History tends to honor those who conquered, those rare individuals capable of bending nations to their will. But few figures have haunted the memory of empires quite like the man who terrorized Rome for 16 relentless years. His name didn't just echo, it roared across centuries, once striking fear into the very heart of the ancient world's most powerful republic. From 264 to 146 BC, two great powers of the Mediterranean locked in a brutal series of wars that would decide the destiny of Europe. In this high-stakes clash, the upstart Roman Republic battled the seasoned Carthaginian Empire merely for land or trade, but for their place in history. Their conflict raged across Sicily, Spain, North Africa, and deep into Italy. The carnage was immense, with entire legions drowned, burned, or buried beneath enemy spears. It was a forge of legends. Regulus, who embraced death rather than betray. His values, Scipio, the mastermind who earned eternal fame as Africanus. But above them stood one man, a Carthaginian commander whose genius almost crushed Rome entirely. His march through the Alps, elephants and all, remains a feat of logistical daring. His ambush at Cannae is still dissected in military academies. Around the world, his reputation grew so fearsome that Roman mothers would hush their children with whispers. Hannibal is coming. Hannibal is at the gates. This is the chronicle of that man, of a childhood vow made before the gods, of a campaign fueled by vengeance, brilliance, and unyielding resolve, of glorious victories and an inevitable fall, of civilizations clashing so fiercely that their echoes shaped the world for centuries. This is the story of Hannibal Barca and the Punic Wars, a tale of power, pride, and the razor's edge between immortality and ruin. In Carthage, where golden sunlight stretched across crumbling stone, a young boy watched his father prepare for war. He was the son of Hamilcar Barca, born to inherit both a name and a mission. It was 237 BC, and Carthage, still bleeding from its defeat in the First Punic War, licked its wounds and bristled with resentment. Rome had done more than win. It had wounded Carthage's pride and threatened its future. In the sacred temple of Baal-Hamon, under flickering torches, the father took his son's hand and placed it upon the altar. The boy swore a solemn vow to never befriend Rome. This was no innocent oath made in youthful ignorance. The very air in the temple seemed to hold its breath. That vow would bind the child's soul more tightly than chains, guiding, shaping, and haunting him as he grew into a man who would shake the world. Carthage had once ruled the western Mediterranean, a jewel founded by Phoenicians from Tyre. Its wealth came not from conquest, but commerce. Rare dyes, precious metals, and exotic wares flowed through its ports, enriching a civilization defined by trade. Its fleet dominated the seas. Its merchants spanned continents. But Rome's rise had upended the balance. The first war between them played out largely on the water, Carthage's domain, and yet it was Rome that emerged victorious. The loss of Sicily was a wound that festered. Then came a revolt from Carthage's own hired soldiers, nearly destroying the city from within. Only Hamilcar's brilliance saved them. As his son came of age, Hamilcar saw a new opportunity. Revenge, but strategy. He turned to Iberia. The rich mines of Spain would restore Carthage's coffers. The rugged warriors of the peninsula would strengthen its armies. As Rome looked east, the Barcids expanded westward. The boy trained by day with skilled horsemen, learning to fight with speed and cunning by night. He studied under Greek scholars, mastering thought as well as swordplay. Then, in 229 BC, tragedy struck. Hamilcar drowned in the Jukar River. Command passed to Hasdrubal, his son-in-law, who favored politics over swords. The young man continued learning through campaigns and treaties. Under Hasdrubal's leadership, Carthage founded New Carthage, a stronghold in Iberia. Rome grew uneasy. In response, the Ebro Treaty was signed, capping Carthaginian expansion northward. It was a fragile peace, laced with mistrust. Then Hasdrubal was assassinated. The army turned to the 25-year-old Hannibal, Hamilcar's true heir. They saw not just a leader, but a continuation of the Barca legacy. Beneath his calm exterior still burned the vow from long ago. Carthage's council hesitated, wary of giving such youth so much power. But in Spain, his campaigns silenced doubt. Tribe after tribe fell or joined him. Hannibal was no ordinary general. He married diplomacy with ruthlessness, tradecraft with tactics. He became the kind of leader Carthage had never seen. Rome watched concerned, but not yet alarmed. The Roman Senate was focused on Greece and Macedon, unaware that across the sea a storm brewed. From the ramparts of New Carthage, Hannibal looked north. The treaty line loomed in his mind. His father's shadow urged him forward. Rome thought future wars would follow old patterns fought on sea or Sicily's soil. They never imagined a threat marching over mountains. Hannibal knew their ways. He knew how to break them. In 219 BC, Saguntum, a Roman ally south of the treaty line, became the target. Local unrest gave Hannibal the excuse he needed. Rome sent warnings. Hannibal answered with silence and action. He marched 8 brutal months past. Siege engines pummeled Saguntum's defenses. Inside, starvation spread like fire. The people fought with desperation, trusting Rome would intervene. Rome did not. The Senate stalled, argued, delayed. As Saguntum burned, Hannibal's engineers dug beneath its walls. When defenders blocked one tunnel, others sprang up. Spring saw the final blow. The citizens, facing defeat, lit their city aflame. Hannibal stood in the ashes, unmoved. Saguntum had fallen. War was inevitable. Rome, furious, sent envoys to Carthage, demanding justice. The city's leaders now faced a terrible decision. Hand over their best general or defy a superpower. Some warned of doom, of Rome's ships and sieges. But anger triumphed over caution. The Roman envoys delivered their ultimatum. The chief ambassador lifted his toga. "In this fold," he said, "I carry war and peace. Choose." Carthage answered, "Whichever you give, we accept." The envoy dropped his robe. "Then I give you war." So began the Second Punic War. Rome began mustering legions, plotting an invasion of Iberia or Africa. But Hannibal had other ideas. As spring blossomed in 218 BC, he prepared a bold stroke. Not against Rome's holdings, but against Rome itself. His army at New Carthage was vast. 90,000 foot soldiers, 12,000 cavalry, and 37 war elephants. It was an army forged from many peoples: African spearmen, Numidian riders, Balearic slingers, Iberian swordsmen, all bound by one man's dream. They moved quickly, crossing the Ebro before Roman fleets could react. The Pyrenees rose before them, cold and defiant. Local tribes resisted, harassed every march. Many men deserted or died. Yet Hannibal pressed on, negotiating with some tribes, crushing others. By autumn, he reached the Alps, the final and greatest barrier. Snow capped the peaks. Soldiers hesitated. Hannibal rallied them. "These are not the gates of heaven," he told them. Women and children have crossed these heights, so shall we. And they began the climb. Narrow trails crumbled underfoot, tribes attacked from cliffs. Men and elephants slipped into ravines. Frostbitten and starving, the army slowed until a rockslide halted them completely. Engineers lit fires against the cliff, cracked the rock with vinegar, and carved a path through stone itself. After 15 days, they reached the summit. Below them lay the green plains of Italy. Hannibal stood alone and looked across the land of his enemy. Behind him were thousands dead. Ahead, the Roman legions waited. Of the original 90,000, just 20,000 infantry remained. The cavalry was halved. Most elephants were gone. But Hannibal had done the impossible. He had brought an army to Italy by land. And as Roman scouts scrambled to understand this invasion, Hannibal found allies among the Gallic tribes, eager to resist Rome. The true war had only just begun. The crossing of the Alps would be in tales and tactics for centuries to come, a symbol of resolve forged in snow, blood, and fire. Yet for the mind behind it, that triumph was merely an introduction. The real campaign was just beginning, and his target was nothing less than the collapse of Rome itself. Upon descending into the plains of Italy, the first encounters revealed a striking philosophical divide. Roman generals clung to formation-heavy discipline, relying on the rigid manipular system that had subdued the Italian peninsula. Hannibal, however, viewed warfare as an art of adaptation. His genius lay not just in commanding troops, but in manipulating terrain, timing, and psychology to turn chaos into advantage. At the Ticinus River, the Republic dispatched a scouting party under the command of Consul Publius Cornelius Scipio. Expecting minor resistance, the Romans were stunned by the ferocity and coordination of Hannibal's cavalry. It wasn't a traditional clash, it was a dance of speed and precision. The nimble Numidian riders and Spanish cavalry carved through the heavier Roman horses with fluid violence. Scipio himself was nearly killed, pulled to safety only by his teenage son, untested youth named Publius Scipio, who would one day earn the title Africanus and return the favor on a far grander scale. Winter's approach brought the next test. In December 218 BC, Hannibal faced the Roman consul Sempronius Longus at the Trebia River. It was here that his brilliance became undeniable. Using psychological warfare, Hannibal lured the Romans into premature engagement. At dawn, after a night of calculated provocation, he drew Sempronius across the icy river. The Roman soldiers entered battle already drenched, exhausted, and freezing. Unbeknownst to them, Hannibal had hidden a force of 2,000 elite troops under his brother Mago in a nearby ravine. As the battle intensified and Roman attention focused forward, Mago's men struck from the rear. Simultaneously, Carthaginian cavalry collapsed the Roman flanks. Encircled, disoriented, and exposed, nearly 20,000 Roman soldiers were slaughtered. A sudden downpour allowed a remnant to escape. But the message was clear. Rome was unprepared for this kind of enemy. With northern Italy reeling, Hannibal used the winter to win hearts and minds. He forged alliances with Gallic tribes who longed to break free from Roman control. But spring came with its own horrors. To reach central Italy, Hannibal's army marched through the Arno Marshes, a pestilent expanse of stagnant water. For 4 days and nights, his men trudged through waist-deep swamps, denied even a dry patch of ground to sleep on. Many fell ill, horses died, and Hannibal himself suffered a severe infection in one eye. He never complained, riding atop his last surviving elephant until the vision in his right eye was lost, an enduring reminder of the campaign's cost. Then came the calamity at Lake Trasimene in 217 BC, where military deception reached its highest expression. The new Roman consul, Gaius Flaminius, was brash and impatient. Believing the Carthaginians were retreating, he pursued without caution along the mist-shrouded lakeshore. What he didn't know, what he never suspected, was that Hannibal had sculpted the battlefield. Overnight, Punic troops had occupied the hills surrounding the narrow lakeside path. When signal fires blazed from hidden posts, thousands of warriors descended in a thunderous wave. The Romans, trapped between water and mountain, couldn't maneuver, couldn't regroup. Their discipline dissolved in the chaos. The result, a massacre. 15,000 Roman soldiers died, including Flaminius himself. Another 15,000 surrendered. Barely 6,000 survived to bring the dreadful news back to Rome. In the capital, panic turned to desperation. The Senate, fearing collapse, enacted a rare emergency measure. Quintus Fabius Maximus was appointed dictator, granted near absolute power to save the Republic. Fabius, wise and calculating, refused to meet Hannibal in open battle. Instead, he adopted a strategy of delay, shadowing the enemy, cutting off foraging parties, avoiding direct confrontation, while bleeding Hannibal's strength slowly. This earned him the mocking title Cunctator, the delayer from his critics. Many Romans derided his caution, yearning for glorious victory. But Fabius understood what they did not. Hannibal could not be beaten in a fair fight. The months dragged on with no decisive engagement. Fabius's strategy frustrated Hannibal, but it also strained Roman politics. The people wanted action, not evasion. As elections loomed, the public clamored for new leadership. In response, two aggressive consuls were chosen for the following: Gaius Terentius Vero and Lucius Aemilius Paulus. These men promised to crush the invader once and for all. Backed by unprecedented resources, they raised the largest army Rome had ever seen, 8 full legions and their allied reinforcements, nearly 80,000 infantry and thousands of cavalry. Their mission was clear: find Hannibal and end the war. They found him near the village of Cani, in southeastern Italy. It was August 16 BC, and the dust-choked plains near the Aufidus River would soon host one of the most infamous battles in human history. Hannibal's army was outnumbered almost 2-1. But numbers alone don't win. War's strategy does. The Carthaginian commander formed a convex line with his weaker Gauls and Spaniards at the center. On the flanks, he positioned his Libyan veterans, disciplined, armored, and deadly. His cavalry, superior in both quality and command, was placed at the wings. As the battle began, the Roman center surged forward, crashing into the bulging middle of Hannibal's formation. The line bent under pressure, slowly giving ground, but it did not break. This was by design, while the Romans pressed forward. The Carthaginian cavalry routed their Roman counterparts and swept around the enemy's flanks. As the Romans advanced further into what seemed like victory, the Libyan infantry turned inward like a vice. Then the cavalry closed the trap from behind, surrounded on all sides. The Roman army was compressed into a seething, immobile mass. Their discipline turned against them. They had no room to fight, no space to breathe. It became not a battle, but a slaughter. For hours, the Carthaginians methodically cut them down. So densely packed were the Romans that many could not even lift their swords. When dusk finally brought silence, the carnage was incomprehensible. Between 50,000 and 70,000 Romans and allies lay dead. Among the slain were both consuls and dozens of senators. Over a third of the Roman Senate had died on that field. Varro escaped with a handful of cavalry, returning to a city frozen in shock. The Battle of Cannae wasn't just a victory, was a masterpiece of annihilation. Centuries later, military scholars would still study its geometry. It remains the definitive example of encirclement warfare. The psychological impact was seismic. Cities across Italy abandoned Rome, defecting to Hannibal. The powerful port of Tarentum opened its gates. Syracuse, sensing the shift in power, joined the Carthaginian cause. Even distant Macedonia, under King Philip V, entered into an alliance. Seeing Rome vulnerable for the first time, in Rome itself, the fear was palpable. Survivors claimed the road to the capital was undefended, the gates practically open. And yet, Hannibal paused. He chose not to march on Rome. When questioned by his cavalry commander Hannibal, the answer was damning. "You know how to win a battle," Hannibal said, "but not how to use the victory." It was perhaps the one moment Hannibal miscalculated not in tactics, but in psychology. Rome, battered and bloodied, would not fall. It would evolve, adapt, and rise again. But for now, its soul had been shaken. The greatest military power in the Western world had been brought to the brink by a man with one eye, an oath sworn in childhood, and a genius unmatched in the chronicles of war. Whether Hannibal's decision not to march on Rome after Cannae was an act of strategic restraint or a missed opportunity has been a subject of debate for centuries. Yet one truth remains untouched by time. The psychological blow dealt to Rome was deep, raw, and enduring. Cannae was more than a battlefield. Loss it was a trauma that scarred the Roman soul. And still, for 15 astonishing years after that victory, Hannibal sustained his army on Italian soil, a feat unmatched in the annals of ancient warfare. Without secure supply routes to Carthage, Hannibal kept his army alive through meticulous management of local resources, strategic alliances with disaffected Italian tribes, and extraordinary operational flexibility. His very presence compelled Rome to deploy multiple armies simultaneously, bleeding the Republic's manpower and financial reserves year after year. But despite his dominance in the south, Rome did not collapse. Instead, it revealed an astonishing trait and inner resilience that would ultimately outlast even the greatest of generals. Where most Mediterranean states might have sued for peace after such devastating defeats, the Roman Senate refused. Not a single negotiation was entertained. The state declared that no treaty would be considered while a foreign army remained on Italian soil. That defiance turned the war into a test of sheer endurance, one which, over time, favored Rome's deep pool of citizens and unmatched organizational discipline. Under the renewed influence of Quintus Fabius Maximus, whose delaying tactics had once been ridiculed, Rome now saw the merit in caution. No longer chasing decisive confrontations, Roman commanders focused instead on retaking rebel cities one at a time. Betrayal was punished, loyalty rewarded. The message was brutal but clear. Hannibal might win battles, but Rome would reclaim its lands slowly, inexorably, and with retribution. This slow grind forced communities across Italy to weigh their choices carefully. Relief under Hannibal might come quickly, but it would be followed eventually by the hammer of Rome to new. Roman leaders would embody this blend of strategic patience and tactical innovation. Marcus Claudius Marcellus, later dubbed the Sword of Rome, struck a balance between Fabian restraint and calculated aggression. In a prolonged siege, he retook Syracuse, the Sicilian jewel that had fallen to Hannibal's influence. Despite the city's formidable defenses, many designed by the legendary Archimedes himself, Roman forces prevailed. The great scientist was reportedly killed by a soldier during the sack, still absorbed in drawing geometric diagrams in the sand. A quiet, tragic death in the middle of conquest. Meanwhile, the strategic landscape was shifting in Iberia, with Carthage's expeditionary force occupied in Italy, their hold over Spain weakened. Into this void stepped a young, unproven Roman Publius Cornelius Scipio, son of the very consul wounded at Ticinus, a nephew to another who perished fighting Carthaginians in the region. Despite his age, he was entrusted with Commander Gamble, born of both pedigree and promise. Scipio did not disappoint. In a dazzling move, he captured New Carthage, the administrative and logistical heart of Punic Spain. He had learned that the lagoon protecting the city's northern flank could be traversed during low tide, driven by a specific wind. Exploiting this obscure natural rhythm, Scipio led a detachment through the shallows, catching the defenders completely unprepared. The city fell, its silver mines, stores, and captives became Roman assets. Carthaginian power in Iberia crumbled. Within a few short years, Scipio had broken Punic control of the peninsula. Hannibal was now cut off from reinforcements, gold, and hope. Upon returning to Rome, Scipio proposed a daring plan. Take the war to Carthage itself, force Hannibal to leave Italy and defend his homeland. The conservative Senate balked at such audacity, but Scipio's popularity and battlefield reputation carried the day. He was elected consul and granted the authority to execute his vision. The African campaign began swiftly. Roman legions landed near Utica, establishing a beachhead. With early successes and the crucial alliance of Numidian Prince Massinissa, Rome gained a foothold on African soil. Now Carthage, seeing its capital threatened, made a painful decision. After 16 years of bloodshed in Italy, they recalled. Their most brilliant general, Hannibal's departure was more than military strategy, was personal agony. The men who had followed him across the Alps, who had survived winter marshes and delivered legendary victories, now turned their backs on the land they had bled in. As they boarded ships in the port of Croton, it is said Hannibal looked back at Italy one last time, a land that had witnessed his triumphs, and where he knew he might never return. The final reckoning took place in the autumn of 202 BC on the plains near the village of Zama. For the first time, the two titans of the Second Punic War, Hannibal, Barca, and Publius Scipio, stood face to face. Hannibal's army was a mix of grizzled veterans, new recruits, and a fearsome contingent of 80 war elephants. But Scipio had studied his foe well. He formed his troops in corridors, creating deliberate gaps through which the elephants would charge, then be harmlessly guided aside. As the battle raged, the infantry lines clashed with brutal force. Yet it was the cavalry that proved decisive. Massinissa's Numidians, fighting now for Rome, routed the Punic horse and circled back to strike the Carthaginian, repeating, in essence, Hannibal's own masterpiece at Cannae. But in reverse, outflanked and outmaneuvered, Hannibal resisted with every ounce of skill and leadership he possessed. But the war had finally turned. His army crumbled. The Second Punic War was over. The terms of peace were devastating. Carthage was stripped of its navy and war elephants, forbidden to wage war without Rome's approval, forced to pay a crushing indemnity, and reduced to a regional power under Roman shadow. The city survived, but only just. Hannibal, now a statesman rather than a general, urged his people to accept peace. He understood the cost of further defiance. As a civic leader, he enacted sweeping reforms, streamlining taxes, reducing corruption, and rebuilding Carthage's economy despite Roman oversight. But Rome was not done with him. Fearing his influence, they demanded his exile. Hannibal fled east, finding refuge at the court of Antiochus III of the Seleucid Empire. There, he served as an advisor in another war against Roma, campaign that would also end in failure. Hunted relentlessly, he moved from court to court, his past always at his heels. Finally, in Bithynia, cornered by agents sent to apprehend him, Hannibal made his last choice. Rather than be paraded through Rome in chains, he took poison. According to Plutarch, his final words were as cutting as they were ironic. "Let us relieve the Romans of the fear which has so long troubled them, since it seems too hard a task to wait for the death of one old man." Decades after his death, Rome launched the Third Punic War, not in response to a threat, but to a rival's recovery. In a savage 3-year campaign, Roman forces under Scipio Aemilianus, adopted grandson of Scipio Africanus, razed Carthage to the ground. The city was burned, its people enslaved, its memory salted into the earth. But Hannibal's legacy survived the flames. His tactical brilliance, diplomatic instincts, and mastery of psychological warfare would shape Roman military doctrine for centuries. In defeat, he had forced Rome to become stronger, more adaptable, more ruthless. His greatest monument lies not in marble or bronze, but in the evolution of an empire that was forever changed by the challenge he posed. He showed the world what one man armed with vision, intellect, and iron resolve could achieve against overwhelming odds. Though he died a fugitive, though his homeland was obliterated, Hannibal remains one of history's most brilliant military minds. His story is not one of defeat, but of the staggering potential of human determination. His war against Rome, though ultimately lost, remains one of the most extraordinary demonstrations of strategic imagination the world has ever seen. And as the dust of history settles, we remember not only the victories and defeats, but the mind that orchestrated them, the man who dared to defy an empire, and for a time almost won. The grievances sown across the Italian countryside by conquest, land confiscation, and punitive Roman administration created a rich soil for discontent. Hannibal, master not only of war but of persuasion, cultivated this unrest with care. After the colossal triumph at Cannae, the map of the conflict widened significantly. Italy's second-largest city, Capua, severed its ties with Rome and pledged allegiance to the Carthaginian cause. For Hannibal, it was a breakthrough. Capua offered fixed infrastructure, something his otherwise mobile army had long lacked: barracks, storehouses, smiths, and access to production capacity. Other dominoes began to teeter. Syracuse, though technically a Roman ally, had functioned under occupation rather than loyalty. Sensing a shift in the balance of power, it declared independence under King Hieronymus, grandson of the great Hiero II. Even more consequential was the reaction from across the Adriatic. Philip V of Macedon, an ambitious king of the Antigonid dynasty, saw opportunity in Rome's staggering vulnerability. Just 3 years after Hannibal crossed the Alps, Philip entered into a formal treaty with Carthage, one that, if fully enacted, could have triggered a two-front war far beyond the Republic's capacity to endure. Yet this alliance remained mostly dormant. Macedon never committed to a full-scale offensive. Had Philip launched a true eastern campaign, history might have turned in Carthage's favor. But even in the face of potential collapse, Rome demonstrated the institutional strength that set it apart. Despite losing tens of thousands of soldiers and enormous wealth, the Roman Senate maintained and, in some cases, even deepened its diplomatic ties. Through a mixture of unwavering resolve and, when necessary, calculated threats, it kept much of the Italian coalition intact. When towns wavered, Rome responded not with appeals, but with iron. Military demonstrations were swift and merciless. Executions of suspected pro-Carthaginian leaders sent chilling messages. But Rome's diplomacy was not built solely on violence. It exploited internal fissures. In Capua, for instance, the Senate discreetly supported conservative elites who bristled under the populist policies Hannibal had introduced. These men formed the core of later revolts against Carthaginian control in Syracuse. Similar divisions were quietly nurtured. As King Hieronymus became increasingly autocratic, discontented factions within the city began correspondence with Roman envoys. When Roman forces eventually moved to retake the city, these hidden alliances proved critical, helping breach Syracuse's formidable defenses from within. Diplomatic competition extended beyond the Italian peninsula. In North Africa, Carthage depended heavily on Numidian cavalry, swift, deadly horsemen from the deserts and hills. But Numidia was not a monolith. It was divided among rival tribes and leaders. Roman agents identified a dispossessed prince named Massinissa, who had a personal vendetta against the ruling Carthaginian-aligned faction. They nurtured this resentment, slowly bringing him into the Roman fold. Massinissa's defection would one day tip the balance at Zama, when his cavalry helped turn the tide against Hannibal. The Roman diplomatic machine worked with equal precision. In the eastern Mediterranean, to check Macedon, they secured an alliance with the Aetolian League, a federation of Greek city-states hostile to Philip. This kept the Macedonian king occupied close to home and away from Italy. Simultaneously, the Romans kept open channels with Ptolemaic Egypt, ensuring that the continent's most fertile grain supplies remained out of Punic reach. This economic containment complemented their battlefield strategies, further isolating Carthage. Perhaps the most dramatic example of this subtle, high-stakes diplomacy played out in the port city of Tarentum. Greek in origin and fiercely proud, its citizens had grown resentful of Roman garrisons and administrative interference. In secret, a faction of the city reached out to Hannibal, offering to betray Rome. The plan succeeded. Carthaginian forces entered the city, but the Roman commander, having caught wind of the conspiracy, withdrew his garrison to the fortified citadel above the harbor. Though the city was lost, the Romans retained control of the sea access, rendering the victory partial, and the port strategically compromised. This series of shadow conflicts highlighted a critical distinction between the two empires. Alliances were personal. His charisma and battlefield brilliance won cities, tribes, and kings. But when he turned his focus elsewhere, many of these ties weakened or dissolved. The Roman system, by contrast, was institutional. The Senate's policies remained consistent despite changing magistrates, military disasters, or electoral turnover. This allowed Rome to project reliability even as it bled on the battlefield. As the war dragged into its second decade, this difference became decisive. Hannibal could not be everywhere at once. His absence in Spain allowed Scipio to reclaim it. His diversion in Italy cost him support in Sicily. Rome's diplomacy, rooted in process rather than personality, outlasted his reach. The peace imposed after Zama reflected Rome's evolved understanding of the Mediterranean chessboard. Rather than erase Carthage, they amputated its limbs while sparing the torso. Carthage retained its African heartland, but lost all overseas territories. It was forbidden to wage war without Roman permission. Its navy was dismantled, its treasury emptied, its autonomy reduced to illusion. Rome turned a former rival into a buffer zone. By forcing it into debt and disarmament, they ensured that Carthage would remain dependent and, by extension, loyal. These constraints shaped Carthage's domestic politics as well. After the war, Hannibal returned home and was elected suffet, the chief magistrate. In that role, he enacted sweeping reforms targeting corruption, restructuring the tax system, and curbing the influence of entrenched oligarchs. These measures, though effective, earned him powerful enemies. Some of those enemies had ties to Rome and were only too happy to conspire in his downfall. The diplomatic net tightened. Hannibal was forced into exile. He fled to the court of Antiochus III of the Seleucid Empire, hoping to aid in another resistance against Roman encroachment. But Rome's agents followed him. From Syria to Armenia, then to Bithynia, each host faced mounting pressure to surrender the legendary general when his final protector prepared to betray him. Hannibal chose his end. He drank poison, escaping the fate Rome had long prepared. His death was quiet but defiant. "Let us relieve the Romans of their anxiety," he is said to have whispered, since it seems too difficult for them to wait for the death of an old man. Though Hannibal died a fugitive, and Carthage later met its annihilation in the Third Punic War, the diplomatic impact of the Second Punic War reverberated for centuries. The contest between Rome and Carthage had begun as a rivalry between commercial powers, but it ended with Rome as the unchallenged hegemon of the Mediterranean, the once multipolar world of independent city-states and regional kingdoms gradually gave way to a unipolar system centered on Roman might. Allies became clients. Clients became subjects. And those who had once played empires against each other were now forced to choose submission or extinction. This transformation was not just military, was political and structural. Rome's alliances, treaties, and diplomatic frameworks reshaped the Mediterranean into a system of Roman-led order. Even after the legions marched home, the ripples continued. Trade routes shifted, coinage changed hands, laws were rewritten. The diplomatic architecture that emerged based on alliances, tribute, and regulated war set patterns that would last not only through the Republic, but well into the imperial era. And even today, echoes of this strategy resonate in modern concepts of great power, politics, alliance, networks, and imperial administration. Behind every spear, hurled and city burned, there was a map being redrawn, not just of borders, but of power itself. The struggle between Hannibal and Rome was not merely a contest of armies, it was a war for the soul of a continent. And it was Rome's capacity to fight with treaties as skillfully as it did with swords that secured its future as master of the known world. The Punic Wars were not merely a series of brutal military engagements, they were also the collision of two vastly different economic worlds. Behind every battlefield clash lay competing systems of production, wealth, distribution, and national identity. Each civilization had its own model, shaped by geography, culture, and centuries of development, with strengths that enabled them to endure, and weaknesses that would ultimately define their fates. Carthage, inheritor of the Phoenician legacy, had built an economy on three core foundations: maritime commerce, expansive agricultural estates, and silver mined from the rugged hills of Iberia. From the beginning, its purpose had been mercantile, situated at a natural crossroads between east and west. Carthage became a hub of exchange. By the 3rd century BC, its commercial tentacles reached from the ports of the Levant to the shores of Britain. Specialized ships traversed well-established sea routes, ferrying goods like dyed textiles, olive oil, wine, ceramics, and luxury metals. This commercial foundation deeply shaped Punic society, whereas in Rome, social elevation flowed through political achievement and military glory. In Carthage, status was often measured in cargo, tonnage, trade contracts, and shipping monopolies. The ruling oligarchy was composed not of landholding senators, but of elite merchant families whose priorities were largely financial. The state's highest council, the body that debated war and peace, often acted with the instincts of a trading guild rather than a political organ. Immediate profit frequently outweighed long-term security. The one consistent exception to this model was the Barcid faction, spearheaded by Hamilcar and Hannibal, who argued often unsuccessfully that Carthage's survival required sustained strategic investment and military assertiveness. This tension between mercantile short-termism and long-term geopolitical awareness would haunt Carthage throughout the conflict. Alongside commerce, Punic prosperity was rooted in its North African hinterlands. The estates surrounding Carthage, managed with a level of agricultural sophistication envied even by Roman agronomists, provided the population with both sustenance and surplus. Writers like Cato, the elder himself, no friend of Carthage, praised their methods: terraced farming, crop rotation, water collection, and soil management. These techniques allowed Carthage to support a population that may have rivaled 500,000 during its golden age. But the real financial engine, especially during wartime, was silver gleaned from the Iberian mines near New Carthage. These mines, staffed largely by slaves laboring under brutal conditions, yielded immense quantities of ore. At their height, they may have produced 300 pounds of silver per day. This metal didn't just fund armies. It underwrote diplomacy, maintained supply chains, and allowed Carthage to compensate for trade disruptions with hard currency. It was, in every sense, the war chest of empire. Rome, by contrast, was built on the back of the plough. Its economy centered on agrarian production, with land primarily held by citizen farmers who were also, crucially, its soldiers. This dual-role farmer and fighter created a social contract in which military service and economic survival were intertwined. It also gave Rome unmatched staying power. While Hannibal could burn fields and destroy villages, he could not erase the people bound to the land, the very people who would rebuild, replant, and return to the legions in Rome. Commerce held lower. Prestige, patrician nobles often avoided direct involvement in trade, seeing it as beneath their station. But the middle class, the equestrian order, began to seize on the opportunities created by expansion. These equities invested in shipping, contracts, and foreign ventures. Their wealth began to exert influence on policy, aligning territorial expansion with economic interest. New provinces meant new markets, more slaves, more resources, and, importantly, more opportunities for tax farming. These differences in structure became vital as the war dragged on. When Carthage lost control of the see-through blockades or shipwreck, it bled revenue. Its economic model was brittle in the face of prolonged disruptions. Rome, on the other hand, had a depth of redundancy. Its farms could be ruined, but the population endured. and its political system rooted in communal obligation and extraordinary resiliently allowed for adaptation under pressure. Carthage's economy began to unravel after the loss of Spain. When Scipio seized New Carthage and pushed the Barcid forces out of Iberia, the silver mines were lost. Without this metallic lifeblood, Carthage could no longer pay its mercenaries reliably. Field armies in Italy grew smaller, less equipped, and less motivated. Hannibal's continued presence on Italian soil became an act of will more than strategic necessity. Rome, too, faced immense economic strain. Entire regions of Italy were reduced to ashes. Some endured 15 straight years of devastation. The traditional grain supply from Sicily and Egypt was periodically cut off. Worse still, the death toll among military-age men was staggering. Perhaps a third of all eligible citizens perished. Yet the Roman system responded not with collapse, but innovation. When treasury reserves ran dry, the Senate enacted emergency measures. Wealthy citizens offered loans, sometimes voluntary, sometimes not, enticed by promises of patriotic repayment. Soldiers went unpaid for months at a time. Currency was debased. Silver content in Roman coinage reduced to stretch the money supply. Even state contracts were delayed, essentially forcing private entities to front the cost of war. And when all else failed, Rome turned to its people. In the aftermath of Cannae, the Senate issued a call not for soldiers, but for silver and gold. Citizens rich and poor donated their personal wealth to fund one more army, one more fleet, one more chance of survival. It was not just economic policy, it was social cohesion weaponized. When peace finally came, the divergent economic consequences became clear. Rome, though battered, had emerged stronger. Land once abandoned was redistributed to veterans. The acquisition of Carthaginian provinces opened new avenues for wealth. Spain, with its mines, and Sicily, with its fertile plains, became Roman provinces, funneling resources directly into the heart of the Republic. The war indemnity imposed on Carthage, spread over 50 years, acted as a long-term investment in Roman recovery. For Carthage, recovery was more difficult. Its economy had to be restructured within tight, Roman-imposed parameters. It could no longer field an army without permission. Its trade was monitored. Its access to foreign markets reduced. Even its attempts to defend against Numidian raids were forbidden under treaty terms. And yet, Carthage persisted. In the interwar period, a quiet economic rebirth began. With the return of Hannibal from exile, the former general redirected his brilliance toward reform. He rooted out corruption, audited the books, forced crooked officials to repay stolen wealth, and even established state monopolies in certain sectors to ensure steady income. His policies allowed Carthage to repay its war indemnity ahead of scheduler feet that, rather than earning Roman praise, ignited fear. Rome saw in Carthage's recovery not resilience, but threat. The Senate insisted that payments continue on the original timeline, refusing to allow the Punic state even symbolic dignity. To Roman minds, a commercially vibrant Carthage, even a disarmed one, was too dangerous to tolerate. This fear planted the seed of the Third Punic War, a war not of defense nor necessity, but of annihilation. Carthage's economy had survived defeat. Its merchants, fields, and silent wharves had quietly begun again. But Rome could not allow even a shadow of competition, and so the axe fell not just on a city, but on an economic model, a way of life, and a civilization that had once traded with kings and reached across oceans. The smoldering remains of Carthage marked the end of a long struggle, not just of soldiers and strategy, but of two visions of how a world might be built and how it might fall. The Third Punic War, often cloaked in rhetoric about national security, was in truth the final act of an economic rivalry dressed as a military necessity. As Carthage began to recover economically within the limitations imposed by the Treaty of Zama, Roman anxieties resurfaced not over immediate military threats, but over the resurgence of a competitor whose maritime commerce, financial discipline, and industrious population posed a challenge to Roman commercial supremacy. This time, it was not the legions who clamored for action, but Rome's commercial elite, particularly the equestrian class, deeply invested in shipping, contracting, and grain trade. Cato, the Elder's relentless refrain, Cartagodolin, est Carthage must be destroyed, resonated across economic strata. For landowners, it symbolized revenge for past devastation. For merchants, it meant eliminating the last serious rival in the Western Mediterranean trade network. This convergence of agricultural indignation and mercantile ambition forged the political consensus that led to total war. The final obliteration of Carthage did more than silence a geopolitical rival. It extinguished a 700-year-old civilization. The economic impact was devastating. Skilled artisans were killed or enslaved, their specialized knowledge lost. Carthaginian guilds that had developed advanced techniques in metallurgy, shipbuilding, and ceramics vanished. Trade networks that had once connected Carthage to Africa, Iberia, and the Levant collapsed into silence. Even the city's banking and credit systems, once among the most sophisticated in the region, were eradicated, triggering financial disruptions that rippled for decades. A few elements of Punic heritage survived only through Roman appropriation. The agronomic expertise captured in Mago's agricultural treatises was deemed valuable enough to be translated into Latin and preserved. It became the only Punic literary work to survive Roman censorship. A bitter irony that the civilization's most enduring voice was not a philosopher, a general, or a poet but a farmer. The annihilation of Carthage removed an essential economic counterbalance in the Mediterranean world. With it went the last bulwark of commercial pluralism in a region increasingly dominated by Roman expansionism. Smaller, trading polities once able to leverage competition between powers for favorable terms were absorbed, silenced, or marginalized. Roman merchants expanded into former Punic markets unopposed, establishing de facto monopolies from Hispania to Cyrenaica. The broader narrative of the Punic conflicts reveals a deeper truth. These were not just wars of soldiers and cities, they were wars of systems. The mercantile pragmatism of Carthage clashed with the territorial agrarian ambitions of Rome. One favored open sea lanes, dispersed capital, and private wealth. The other relied on land ownership, military citizenship, and the structural integration of economy, war, and governance. Carthage may have been wealthier, but Rome was more resilient. That resilience was institutional. Rome's economy did not simply support its armies, it was its army. Farms grew soldiers, soldiers fought to protect farms, and the Senate managed both. This created a feedback loop that could weather catastrophe. Even in the darkest years, Rome survived, not through riches, but through cohesion. And beyond the numbers, beyond the silver and the grain, lay a transformation even deeper than economic sculpture. The prolonged conflict with Carthage reshaped Roman identity in ways both subtle and profound. Before the Punic Wars, Rome was parochial, conservative, and culturally inward-looking. Its values were rooted in ancestral rites, civic virtue, and military duty. Art was utilitarian, religion was transactional, philosophy was Greek. In contrast, Carthaginian society, born of Phoenician seafaring and steeped in centuries of multicultural interaction, was cosmopolitan and syncretic. Their pantheon reflected Egyptian, Near Eastern, and Hellenistic influences. Their architecture was monumental, their aesthetics fluid. They were not simply merchants, but intermediaries of cultures. As Rome conquered former Punic territories, it encountered urban planning, agricultural infrastructure, and administrative models far more advanced than many Italian counterparts. The pragmatic Romans, ever willing to adopt what worked, incorporated these innovations piecemeal. Their colonies in Sicily, Iberia, and North Africa soon bore traces of Carthaginian systems, terraces, double-entry bookkeeping. But not all contact was adopted at a distance. The presence of Hannibal's army in Italy for nearly 2 decades catalyzed deep cultural anxiety. His victories were not just battlefield defeats, they were existential threats. Rome responded with religious panic. After Cannae, human sacrifices, strictly forbidden under normal Roman practice, were carried out as propitiation. A desperate attempt to win back divine favor, cultural figures rose in response to this trauma. Poets like Ennius began crafting historical epics that recast Roman defeat as destiny's delay, not its end. A new mythology of Roman inevitability took shape. The state, once reactive, began curating its own legend. But the influence ran both ways. Hannibal's multinational coalition comprising Iberians, Numidians, Gauls, and Greeks required an extraordinary degree of cultural sensitivity. His army was a case study in managing linguistic, religious, and ethnic diversity. Carthaginians adopted elements of Roman fortification, design, and siege. Romans, in turn, integrated Punic shipbuilding and supply techniques into their growing navy. When the war ended, Rome found itself governing a patchwork of cultures. Its old modalities, signed for Latin allies, no longer sufficed. In former Punic lands, Roman governors preserved effective elements of Carthaginian administration, while overlaying them with Roman law. This hybrid governance gave rise to a cultural synthesis: Latin legalism supported by Punic bureaucratic precision. Cultural transmission was not limited to bureaucracy. Rome's first historian, Quintus Fabius Pictor, wrote his account of the war in Greek, acknowledging the need to speak to a pan-Mediterranean audience. Around the same time, the first Latin translations of Greek literature began to appear. Rome, reluctantly, was becoming part of a larger world. Hannibal, in his brief post-war political career, applied lessons from both systems. He reformed Carthage's taxation along Roman lines. He introduced checks on aristocratic power, but he never abandoned Punic identity. His was a selective hybridization, one that recognized the strength of Roman systems while refusing cultural capitulation. Religion reflected these transformations most vividly. Roman cult practices, once simple and rigid, became more open. The state sanctioned the worship of Cybele, a mother goddess of Anatolian origin, during the latter years of the war. This openness, however, had limits. The Senate firmly rejected elements of Punic religion it deemed abhorrent, most notably the practice of child sacrifice. Adoption did not mean assimilation. Ironically, the destruction of Carthage ensured the survival of some aspects of its culture. Roman farmers read Punic treatises on crop rotation, Roman merchants used Carthaginian maps. The victors, having buried their enemy, kept its tools. In the end, Rome did not just win a war, it absorbed an empire. It inherited what it could, feared what it could not control, and destroyed what it could not assimilate. But it never forgot Hannibal, nor what Carthage had once been. Their ashes fertilized not just the soil of empire, but the roots of the Roman world that followed. That the architectural and engineering expertise developed in Punic North Africa did not vanish with the fall of Carthage. Instead, it seeped into Roman practice, gradually influencing construction throughout newly conquered territories. Techniques for harbor building, agricultural terracing, and urban planning, refined over generations by Carthaginian engineers, were adapted and replicated in Roman colonies across the Mediterranean. The very aqueducts and roads that symbolized Roman order bore traces of Punic ingenuity beneath their polished stones. Likewise, Carthage's once vast maritime trade network, stretching from the Levant to Iberia, provided Rome with a blueprint. As Roman influence expanded, particularly after the Second Punic War, they filled the vacuum left by Punic collapse, adopting and extending many of the same routes, partnerships, and commercial hubs. What had once been Punic lanes became Roman arteries. The infrastructure of a fallen rival served as the skeleton of an emerging empire. This cultural and administrative absorption extended even further as Rome's gaze turned eastward. In governing the diverse populations of Greece, Asia Minor, and eventually the Levant, Roman administrators relied heavily on systems and precedents forged during their management of former Carthaginian territories. The multiculturalism demanded by imperial expansion had, in effect, been rehearsed during the Punic conflicts. Rome learned not to overwrite local cultures, but to co-opt them, selectively blending Latin legal authority with local traditions and elites to maintain stability without erasure for later generations. The memory of the Punic Wars became more than history, it became myth. Hannibal's name lingered in Roman consciousness, not merely as a general, but as a force of nature. Cato, the elder's relentless invocation of Carthago delenda est, became a ritual chant, a psychological cleansing of past trauma. Rome's poets and historians, Virgil, Livy, Silius, Italicus, did not just recount battles, they wove them into a cultural epic. Rome was not just a republic that had won, it was a civilization that had deserved to win by virtue of its moral discipline and inherent superiority. Within this literary alchemy, Hannibal was transformed from foe to archetype. He became the ultimate adversary, cunning, brilliant, austere. Even Cicero, in his philosophical dialogues, portrayed Hannibal as a man of extraordinary virtue, disciplined, loyal to his cause, and unmatched in strategic brilliance. He was dangerous, not because he was evil, but because he was admirable. In doing so, Roman writers made Hannibal the perfect foiler mirror that reflected Rome's own virtues by contrast and occasionally by similarity. This cultural construction served a purpose. It filled psychological needs within Roman society, offering closure and meaning to what had once been near. It also helped crystallize one of Rome's most enduring legacies, a model of imperial governance rooted not in homogenization, but in calibrated integration. The Roman experience with Carthage showed that cultural contact did not necessitate cultural collapse. Administrative success could coexist with ethnic plurality. An empire could function through partnership, not merely domination. This paradigm would echo for centuries. Byzantine emperors drew upon it as they balanced Latin traditions with Greek reality. Early modern European colonialists borrowed similar strategies, often unwittingly adapting local elites and institutions rather than replacing them outright. In this way, the cultural repercussions of the Punic conflict extended far beyond its original participants, shaping the very principles of empire building in the Western tradition. Carthage, despite its physical destruction, achieved a paradoxical form of immortality. Its contributions, technological, commercial, and administrative, were absorbed, rebranded, and propagated by the very empire that had obliterated it. Its cultural DNA lived on, embedded in Roman stonework, legislation, and ideology. 2000 years after Roman soldiers salted Carthage's fields and scattered its stones, the echoes of that conflict continue to resonate. Military thinkers, political scientists, and cultural historians still turn to the Punic Wars, not only for what they say about antiquity, but for what they reveal about enduring patterns of human behavior. In the realm of military thought, the Punic Wars stand as a defining crucible. The Battle of Cannae, Hannibal's masterpiece, remains a case study in tactical perfection. Its double envelopment maneuver is still taught in military academies around the world. From Frederick the Great's oblique attack at Leuthen to Moltke's encirclements in the Franco-Prussian War, to Schwarzkopf's left hook during Operation Desert Storm, the spirit of Cannae persists. It was not merely a battle, it was a template. But Hannibal's genius extended beyond formation and force. His Italian campaign pioneered principles of maneuver warfare, strategic deception, and psychological domination. He shattered expectations, crossed mountains thought uncrossable, and maintained cohesion across an army of dozens of ethnicities. His war was asymmetrical, dynamic, and unpredictable. In him, future generations from Sun Tzu to T.E. Lawrence found inspiration for how the weak might defeat the strong. Rome's counter-strategy was equally influential. Fabius Maximus, mocked in his time for caution, proved that space could be traded for time, and that endurance could defeat brilliance. The so-called Fabian strategy, dealing, harassing, avoiding, direct confrontation, would later be employed by everyone from Russian generals resisting Napoleon to guerrilla movements facing conventional armies. In modern military doctrine, this distinction remains essential. The difference between winning battles and winning wars. Rome's ultimate triumph lay not in any single engagement, but in its systemic capacity to absorb loss, adapt tactics, and regenerate strength. Contemporary officers and theorists study the Punic Wars not for nostalgia, but for insight into how strategy, logistics, morale, and civil resilience must align. The political ramifications were no less enduring. Hannibal's existential threat catalyzed constitutional innovation in Rome. Temporary dictatorships, emergency levies, special tribunals, these mechanisms enabled survival, but they also left a dangerous precedent. Later figures Sulla invoke these powers not as exceptions, but as norms. The Republic, in defending itself, had created the tools of its own undoing. Yet even in decline, Rome remained shaped by its struggle with Carthage. The war had taught it pragmatism, ruthlessness, and vision. It had taught it how to administer difference, how to wage total war, and how to mythologize its past. Through this long and bitter crucible, Rome became something larger than a city-state. It became an idea, and in that transformation, born in the fires of war, tempered by cultural encounter, and etched into stone and story, Carthage, too, endures, not in ruins, but in influence, not as a relic, but as a root system beneath the empire that rose above it. What began as a conflict between two city-states ended as a foundation for Western civilization's enduring strategies of conquest, governance, and cultural negotiation. The Punic Wars were not only about who would rule the Mediterranean, they were about what kind of world would emerge from the struggle. And we are still living in that world. Beyond the immediate aftermath of the Punic Wars, Rome's victory produced more than a redrawing of maps. It redefined relationships within the empire itself. The incorporation of Carthage's former territories, especially in North Africa and Spain, fundamentally altered the dynamics between Roman citizens, allied communities, and subject populations. These newly acquired regions, rich in cultural complexity and economic productivity, demanded new governance strategies. The ad hoc systems of military occupation and senatorial oversight that had sufficed during earlier Italian expansion were no longer adequate. This necessity sparked administrative innovation. What began as pragmatic adaptations, appointing governors, collecting taxes, maintaining local elites, would evolve into the sophisticated provincial system of the Roman Empire. Former Carthaginian territories became experimental grounds where Rome learned to rule not just through conquest, but through continuity and compromise. Governance increasingly became a negotiation between Latin legalism and regional autonomy. The exposure to Carthage's advanced bureaucratic traditions also challenged Roman political culture. The Punic model, steeped in merchant councils, commercial guilds, and oligarchic pragmatism, presented a distinct counterpoint to Rome's own senatorial republicanism. This comparison would not be forgotten. Centuries later, political theorists would return to this clash of systems, seeking insight into the principles that sustained republics and empires alike. Niccolò Machiavelli, writing during the turbulence of Renaissance Italy, gave considerable attention to the Punic Wars in his discourses on Livy. He contrasted Rome's capacity for institutional reform with what he interpreted as Carthage's commercial inertia and oligarchic stagnation. Yet even in his critique, Machiavelli acknowledged the efficiency and discipline that had once allowed Carthage to rival Rome. His analysis helped establish interpretive frameworks that would inform Enlightenment thinkers, Republican theorists, and modern political scientists seeking to understand the interplay between civic virtue, institutional design, and military necessity. The economic reverberations of Carthage's destruction also extended far beyond its own ruins. The annihilation of a vibrant commercial civilization removed a powerful counterbalance to Roman economic dominance. Previously, smaller trading powers could navigate between competing empires to secure favorable trade terms. With Carthage gone, Roman merchants increasingly dictated the rules of Mediterranean commerce. This unchallenged supremacy transformed Rome's economy. Provincial territories were not merely annexed, they were systematically exploited. Tribute, taxes, and slaves poured into the capital. A pattern emerged, one that would become familiar across later imperial systems. Wealth concentrated at the center, while the periphery was drained to support military campaigns, monumental architecture, and elite leisure. At the same time, the Roman economy also absorbed and disseminated Punic innovations. Agricultural practices recorded in Mogo's agronomic treatise, translated and preserved under senatorial order, revolutionized food production across the empire. Techniques such as crop rotation, dryland farming, and complex irrigation systems enhanced yields in Italy, Gaul, and Africa alike. These practical inheritances of Punic civilization, disconnected from the language and people that had birthed them, became part of Rome's imperial toolkit. Carthaginian shipbuilding expertise. 2. Lived on beneath Roman hulls, the very pox. Romana, with its reliable sea lanes and booming trade, owed part of its logistical infrastructure to the maritime genius of the civilization Rome had obliterated. In this paradox, Carthage found a second life, not as a rival, but as an anonymous contributor to the empire that claimed total victory. Yet it is perhaps in the cultural imagination that Carthage and Hannibal achieved their most enduring legacy. Hannibal's 16-year campaign in Italy, conducted with minimal resupply and constant adversity, became a model of heroic resistance. His audacity crossing the Alps, outmaneuvering the best Roman generals, holding the Republic hostage on its own soil, left an indelible mark. In Roman culture, Hannibal became more than an enemy. He became a myth. His defeat made Rome's triumph sweeter, more hard-earned, and thus more legitimate. He became the ideal adversary, brilliant, disciplined, relentless. To defeat him was to prove Rome's divine mandate. This narrative construction served multiple political and psychological purposes. It allowed Rome to justify extreme wartime actions like the human sacrifices following Cannae, and later the utter destruction of Carthage's necessary responses to an extraordinary threat. The more formidable the enemy, the more heroic the Roman response appeared. In subsequent centuries, Hannibal's legend only grew. For European imperial powers seeking to justify campaigns against civilized adversaries, opponents who were not savage, but sophisticated, the figure of Hannibal offered a template. He was both an inspiration and a foil, a man to be admired and defeated, a worthy opponent whose fall validated the victor. Literature across eras returned to this figure again and again. Livy presented him with admiration tempered by moral judgment. Caelius Italicus, writing under the Roman Empire, treated him with poetic grandeur. Later European writers, steeped in neoclassical education, interpreted Hannibal as the prototype of the tragic genius possessing everything but victory. This dichotomy, admired enemy, defeated Oder, allowed Rome and its cultural descendants to maintain moral certainty even while engaging in conquest. Hannibal was brilliant, yes, but he was Punic. His religion was foreign, his motives suspect. Livy captured this tension, portraying Hannibal as both admirable and alien, a master of strategy and discipline, yet burdened by the faithlessness of his people and the unknowable strangeness of his gods. In this way, the Punic Wars did more than reshape borders, they reshaped imagination. They taught Rome, and those who came after, how to think about empire, identity, and legitimacy. They forged a mythology of righteous expansion, of virtuous republics overcoming decadent enemies. And through that mythology, they provided a lens through which subsequent powers would justify their own ambitions. What had begun as a contest between two Mediterranean cities became a defining narrative of Western civilization. Carthage lost the war, but its ghost walked alongside Rome for centuries, whispering caution, offering wisdom, demanding remembrance. And in the figure of Hannibal, commander, exile, reformer, the world found an enduring symbol of brilliance. Unbowed by defeat, his legacy, and that of the city he championed, outlasted the stones of Carthage and the salt sown into its fields. It lived in Rome's aqueducts and Africa's farms, in Latin treatises and European political theory, in military manuals and philosophical dialogues. Carthage fell, but it did not vanish. Through destruction came integration, and through integration mortality. This complex portrayal of Hannibal both feared and admired allowed Roman audiences to compartmentalize their response to a formidable enemy. It gave them permission to respect what he represented without ever having to accept what he stood for. This duality admiration, laced with alienation, became a psychological mechanism that echoed across time, replicated in countless narratives about worthy but vanquished foes. It satisfied the Roman need to see themselves as both virtuous victors and tested champions. The Renaissance, with its rediscovery of classical antiquity, found in the Punic Wars a reservoir of insight for a turbulent age. Thinkers like Petrarch saw in the conflict a moral parable, while Machiavelli mined for lessons in power, statecraft, and republican resilience. In his discourses on Livy, Machiavelli juxtaposed Rome's flexible republican institutions against Carthage's oligarchic rigidity and commercial pragmatism. To him, Hannibal's brilliance and Carthage's downfall were not contradictions, but complementary forces, revealing the enduring tension between personal genius and systemic strength. Artists of the era elevated Hannibal to the ranks of Alexander and Caesar, depicting him in paintings and sculptures as one of the great men of antiquity. Yet visual cues, exotic armor, darker complexions, or distant gazes often distinguished him as the foreign other. The Carthaginian remained powerful, but always slightly removed from the classical canon, reinforcing both his glory and his outsider status. The Enlightenment approached the Punic conflict with new tools: rationalism, empirical inquiry, and emerging theories of political economy. Montesquieu, in his considerations on the causes of the greatness of the Romans and their decline, examined how environmental, institutional, and economic factors contributed to the strengths and weaknesses of each society. He identified reliance on commerce and mercenaries as both a strength in short-term mobilization and a liability in prolonged warfare, a contrast to Rome's agrarian base and citizen-soldier model. This form of analysis became foundational for modern historiography, influencing generations of historians who sought to explain history through structures rather than personalities alone. During the Romantic era, Hannibal's passage over the Alps emerged as the defining symbol of human resolve, confronting nature's fury. J.M.W. Turner's evocative 1812 painting Snowstorm, Hannibal and his army crossing the Alps, cast the general as a dark silhouette, dwarfed by a swirling vortex of snow and chaos. In this rendering, Hannibal is not merely a tactician, he is an existential figure, embodying human ambition, braving the indifference of the universe. The image paralleled contemporary efforts by Napoleon, whose own Alpine crossings invited comparison with the ancient general. History, once again, shaped how the present understood itself. In modern times, the Punic Wars retained their cultural resonance. Films, novels, and essays revisit Hannibal's saga, mining it for themes of asymmetric warfare, resistance against overwhelming force, and the lone visionary challenging institutional behemoths. His story speaks to an age fascinated by guerrilla leaders, revolutionary tacticians, and insurgent intellects. As long as institutions exist, there will be stories of those who challenge them. Hannibal remains the archetype. More profoundly still, the Punic Wars left an imprint on how we study history itself. Edward Gibbon, whose Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire became a foundational text for modern historical scholarship, saw in Rome's victory over Carthage the beginnings of a deeper decline. With no external enemy left to threaten it, Rome lost the crucible that had once forged its unity. Triumph, Gibbon warned, can sow the seeds of decay. This insight transformed how historians approached power. The notion that internal vitality, depends on external challenge became central to theories of empire, decline, and civilizational dynamics. The memory of Carthage became not just a cautionary tale about defeat, but a warning to victors about the illusions of permanence. Meanwhile, archaeology continues to enrich our understanding of the ancient conflict. Excavations are long suspected. Alpine routes have confirmed details long dismissed as myth, validating classical accounts and shedding light on the logistical marvel of the crossing. Underwater investigations in Mediterranean harbors have recovered vessels bearing both Roman and Punic designs, revealing a naval arms race long overshadowed by land campaigns. For modern strategists, the conflict remains a masterclass in asymmetry. Hannibal's campaign demonstrated that brilliance, mobility, and coalition building can confound even the most entrenched power. Rome's response proved that endurance, infrastructure, and institutional memory can outlast short-term brilliance. These lessons about how states survive, how leaders innovate, and how systems evolve remain relevant in a world still marked by power imbalances and unexpected disruption. Perhaps the most enduring legacy lies not in tactics or governance, but in philosophical reflection. Hannibal's campaign stretched the limits of what was possible in his time. He held together a multinational force across linguistic, cultural, and geographic boundaries. He fed and supplied them without consistent reinforcements. He adapted his strategies to forests, mountains, rivers, and cities facing an enemy that outnumbered and outresourced him at nearly every turn. His achievements remind us of the capacity for extraordinary individual action. And yet, Rome's victory reminds us of something equally profound: the power of collective effort. The Senate, the citizen farmer, the cautious general, and the enduring law of these forces together triumphed not by defeating Hannibal outright, but by surviving him. This juxtaposition, individual genius versus institutional resilience, is a defining tension not only in antiquity, but in the modern world. We celebrate visionaries, but we depend on systems. We admire disruption, but we require stability. The Punic Wars give us both, and so, more than 22 centuries after the fields of Zama fell silent, the clash between Rome and Carthage continues, echo-shaping how we think about war, empire, identity, and human possibility. What began as a regional contest between two Mediterranean powers evolved into one of the foundational narratives of Western civilization. It is a story of fear and ambition, of betrayal and loyalty, of brilliance and endurance. It is the story of a general who crossed the Alps because no one believed it could be done, and of a republic that rose from catastrophe to dominate the known world. It is the story of how civilizations remember their enemies and, in doing so, reveal themselves beyond battlefield maneuvers and historical milestones. Beyond the dust of destroyed cities and the ink of chroniclers lies a human drama. Hannibal Barca, born into the Barcid legacy in 247 BC, was more than a general. He was a son raised in the long shadow of his father, Hamilcar, whose military genius had preserved Carthage through its darkest hour. To the Romans, he was the scourge of Italy. To his soldiers, he was a leader who never wavered. To history, he is a question that still demands an answer. What might have been? Contemporary descriptions note the striking resemblance between father and son, the same sharp eyes, the same stern presence, the same uncanny ability to earn the loyalty of men from distant lands. From the heat of North Africa to the snows of the Alps, from the banks of the Tessinus to the plains of Zama, Hannibal's story stretches across time as a reminder of what human determination can accomplish and what it sometimes cannot. Rome destroyed Carthage, but Hannibal was never truly vanquished. He lives in the memory of empire, in the fears of republics, and in the dreams of every strategist who dares to defy the odds. His footprints remain not only in alpine snow, but in the foundations of the world we built after him. Unlike many children of exceptional parents, who collapse beneath the weight of inherited expectations, Hannibal Barca not only survived his father's formidable legacy, but built upon it. Rather than existing in the shadow of Hamilcar, he became a light in his own right, reflecting inherited virtues while cultivating his own path. Where Hamilcar had preserved Carthage during crisis, Hannibal would redefine its place in history. Ancient sources emphasize that Hannibal's early development was not merely martial but deeply intellectual. He was fluent in Greek philosophy, steeped in Stoic and Cynic thought, and widely read in Homeric literature and tactical treatises. His mastery of multiple languages, Greek, Latin, Punic, and several Iberian dialects, was not just an academic exercise, it was a critical tool of leadership. This linguistic fluency allowed Hannibal to communicate directly with every part of his vast, multicultural army, eliminating the reliance on interpreters that had hindered many ancient commanders. He could speak to an Iberian chieftain in his native tongue, rally Numidian horsemen with clarity, and understand Roman proclamations without assistance. This communicative capacity enhanced his command effectiveness and symbolized his commitment to unity through respect rather than domination. It allowed him to build coalitions not as a distant overlord but as an engaged leader, trusted and accessible. His personal life reinforced this leadership style. Far from indulging in the opulence often associated with Carthaginian aristocracy, Hannibal embraced a lifestyle of deliberate austerity. Polybius, no friend of Carthage, but dedicated to historical accuracy, described how the general slept on the ground beside his troops, ate the same coarse rations, and endured the same physical hardships, from mountain storms to battlefield fatigue. This shared suffering forged bonds that no speech or silver could buy. He did not lead from above, but from within. Even Roman historians, hostile though they were, begrudgingly acknowledged his remarkable self-discipline. Unlike Alexander, whose triumphs were often followed by drunken revels and impulsive decisions, Hannibal abstained from excess. He moderated his consumption of food and wine, eschewed luxuries, and maintained restraint in matters of the flesh. This wasn't only about image, it had strategic benefits. Clear judgment, physical endurance, and a stable temperament were military assets, and Hannibal embodied them by design. His marriage patterns reveal his diplomatic acumen. His primary union with an Iberian noblewoman strengthened tribal alliances and signaled his respect for local customs. He became not merely a conqueror of Iberia, but a participant in its socio-political fabric. And while Livy suggests the presence of other female companions within his camp mirroring Punic elite practices, there is little evidence of indulgence. These relationships were strategic, cultural, and familial, not symbols of hedonism. More telling still was his rapport with subordinates. While Roman commanders often clung to rigid social hierarchies, Hannibal maintained a far more meritocratic structure. He routinely sought advice from officers regardless of noble birth, promoting individuals like Hannibal as cavalry commander on the basis of talent rather than lineage. Hannibal's devastating flanking maneuvers, decisive in many battles, were empowered by Hannibal's willingness to recognize brilliance wherever it arose. This egalitarian ethos extended to the battlefield itself. Hannibal frequently conducted personal reconnaissance, risking ambush to study terrain firsthand. He did not rely solely on scouts, he trusted his own eyes. This intimate knowledge of the landscape often translated into tactical mastery, as seen at Trebia, Trasimene, and Cannae. Soldiers admired him not just for intellect, but for courage. He endured what they endured, bled where they bled. That courage was not only physical. Hannibal's emotional discipline also set him apart. During the brutal crossing of the Arno marshes, he lost sight in one jaja, devastating injury. Yet he showed no visible despair. His calm presence reassured his troops. He did not suppress fear, but mastered it. And perhaps most remarkably, he did so without losing empathy. His treatment of prisoners offers insight into his pragmatism and humanity. After the catastrophic Roman defeat at Cannae, Hannibal released captured Italian allies without ransom. Roman citizens, however, he retained for exchange or leverage. This selective clemency had purpose: to undermine Rome's alliances while preserving strategic options. It demonstrated psychological acuity, understanding that brutality wasn't always power. Sometimes mercy was more dangerous. The trait most frequently emphasized in ancient accounts, both hostile and sympathetic, was Hannibal's extraordinary adaptability. He altered his tactics not out of desperation but design. When faced with aggressive consuls, he exploited overconfidence. When Fabius Maximus adopted delay, Hannibal turned to evasion and economic disruption. He adapted without compromising his overarching goal: Rome's isolation and eventual capitulation. This balance between short-term flexibility and long-term vision is a hallmark of strategic genius. It suggests not just a brilliant tactician, but a coherent thinker, a commander with both horizon and foresight. After the war, this strategic intelligence transferred into civic life. Returning to Carthage after Zama, Hannibal did not retire in bitterness. Instead, he entered politics, reforming tax systems, auditing public accounts, and confronting elite corruption. He made enemies quickly. His refusal to enrich himself at the state's expense earned public admiration but political isolation. His loyalty to family remained central. He placed his brothers Hasdrubal and Mago in high command, despite their youth. This fraternal bond, rooted in the tutelage of Hamilcar, fostered trust within his leadership circle, though it may have sometimes blinded him to their limitations. Religiously, Hannibal exhibited sophisticated syncretism, while Roman accounts vilified Carthaginian sacrificial practices. More nuanced evidence suggests Hannibal honored local deities respectfully wherever he campaigned. He offered sacrifices before major undertakings but maintained a philosophical reserve typical of Hellenistic aristocrats. His religiosity was practical, symbolic, and strategic. Even in defeat, Hannibal revealed profound psychological resilience. He did not collapse under disgrace. Instead, he served as a diplomat, advisor, and strategist to Eastern monarchs, always remaining politically active. His refusal to commit suicide in despair set him apart from the tragic norm of ancient commanders. When finally cornered, Hannibal chose death not out of nihilism, but autonomy. His final words, as recorded by Plutarch, "Let us relieve the Romans of their anxiety," were a bitter epigram on Roman paranoia and enduring fear. This ending, defiant yet measured, speaks to a deeper truth. Hannibal's legacy was not annihilated. With Carthage, it persisted in Roman nightmares, in imperial adaptations, in philosophical debates. He was not merely a general. He was an enduring symbol of what a single, determined mind can achieve against the machinery of empire. The psychological portrait that emerges is not simple. He was not a demon, nor a saint. He was a man of remarkable integration, combining adaptability with purpose, charisma with rigor, emotional control with human warmth, innovation with tradition. His story embodies questions that still shape the human experience. How does one honor inherited duty while forging one's path? How does one remain principled in the face of defeat? What is the measure of success, conquest, or endurance? Modern psychological evaluation, constrained by ancient BIAS and limited records, can only speculate. Yet the consistency of testimony suggests a rare synthesis: the emotional intelligence to lead diverse peoples, the cognitive agility to outthink institutions, and the moral stamina to confront failure without surrender. Hannibal Barca remains one of the most complete figures in military history, not because he won, but because of how he fought, how he led, and how he endured. His legacy is not confined to maps or monuments, but embedded in the questions we ask about leadership, resilience, and the reach of human possibility. His life, like his war, crossed boundaries, geographical, cultural, philosophical, and though Rome claimed the victory, it is Hannibal who continues to inspire the deeper reflection. Hannibal's unyielding commitment to strategic vision, even in the face of repeated tactical reversals, reveals a rare quality: persistence without rigidity. Where lesser leaders double down on failing approaches, mistaking obstinacy for strength, Hannibal adjusted course, reoriented tactics, and reshaped objectives without ever losing sight of his core anther: destabilization of Roman power and the reassertion of Carthaginian independence. Perhaps more profoundly, his life offers one of antiquity's clearest illustrations of how exceptional human capability transcends reductive labels. He defies easy classification: not merely a military genius, nor only a statesman, not entirely Carthaginian, yet never betraying his cultural origins, not a traditional aristocrat, yet far from a populist rebel. His very identity became an integration of apparent contradictions: warrior and philosopher, reformer and traditionalist, conqueror and exile. Hannibal Barca emerges not as a mythic outlier, but as a fully human figure, more remarkable in reality than in legend. His abilities were not bestowed by fate or divine favor. They were cultivated through education, discipline, and experience. His endurance, his strategic imagination, his capacity to lead and adapt, these were the products of deliberate development, not supernatural inheritance. And in this lies perhaps the most enduring insight of his life: that history's greatest impacts are often made not by the miraculous, but by the disciplined, by individuals who hone diverse abilities, bind them to a coherent purpose, and deploy them with sustained courage even when the odds defy reason. To millennia after his death, it is not merely Hannibal's conquests that remain compelling, it is the way he confronted adversity, the human qualities he embodied under pressure. This fully human legacy of cultivated greatness may be most lasting contribution to how we understand leadership, possibility, and history itself. Yet, while land campaigns tend to dominate the public memory of the Punic conflicts, the maritime dimension proved equally decisive in shaping their outcomes. The Mediterranean was not merely a backdrop, it was a battlefield, a highway, and a lifeline. Naval power dictated the tempo of campaigns, enabled or constrained supply, and and often determined the boundaries of empire. At the outset of the First Punic War, Carthage's naval dominance appeared unassailable. It boasted a seafaring tradition inherited from its Phoenician founders, who had ruled the sea lanes for centuries. Its shipyards produced the most advanced warships of the age, including the quinquirema, massive multi-decked vessel propelled by rows of coordinated oarsmen and designed for ramming and boarding. Carthaginian sailors possessed deep familiarity with wind patterns, coastal geography, and open-sea navigation. Their naval bases spanned from North Africa to Sardinia, from Spain to Sicily. Rome, by contrast, was a land power. Before 264 BC, it had little need for a fleet. Its wars had been fought over land first, against local Italian tribes, then against Greek colonies in the south. Naval operations were limited to escorting merchant ships and coastal patrols. Rome possessed few warships, fewer experienced sedzels, and almost no admirals. This imbalance might have ended the war before it began, were it not for one of the most astonishing displays of adaptive innovation in ancient history. According to Polybius, the Romans captured a beached Carthaginian quinquireme and used it as a prototype. Within mere months, they had constructed over 100 warships. Lacking trained rowers, they practiced on dry land, building wooden benches and/or frames to simulate movement. It was an audacious experiment, and it worked. Recognizing that they could not outmaneuver Carthaginian crews in traditional naval combat, Roman engineers devised the corvassor pivoting boarding bridge with a metal spike. When dropped onto an enemy deck, it locked the two ships together, allowing Roman legionaries to board and fight as they would on land. It was an elegant solution, turned sea battles into land battles. The Battle of Mylae in 260 BC showcased this tactic. Gaius Duilius, commanding the new fleet, used the corvus to devastating effect, winning Rome's first naval victory. The Senate honored him with a triumph complete with a column adorned with ship beaks, an early monument to Roman naval aspiration. From that point forward, naval warfare became central. The Battle of Agnomus in 256 BC, involving over 300 ships and 150,000 men, remains one of the largest naval engagements in history. Rome prevailed, but success was fleeting. The following year, nature struck. A violent storm off the Sicilian coast destroyed nearly 280 ships and drowned 100,000 sailors and soldiers. It was a calamity unmatched even at Cannae. These maritime disasters exposed the limits of Roman seamanship. The Mediterranean was not merely a battlefield, was a capricious adversary. Winter storms, treacherous currents, and unpredictable squalls shaped the rhythm of war. Amphibious operations had to be timed with seasonal precision. Supply lines required heavy escort. Commanders who ignored these realities often paid dearly, as Publius Claudius Pulchar did at the Battle of Drepana, when impiety, arrogance, and tactical miscalculation resulted in a humiliating Roman defeat. Still, Rome persevered. Institutional persistence allowed for continuous rebuilding. Carthage, meanwhile, grew increasingly cautious. After the Treaty of Lutatius ended the First Punic War in 241 BC, Carthage retained a reduced fleet and focused on commercial rather than military expansion. The Punic state invested in trade, developing merchant networks while quietly maintaining a navy capable of protecting its shipping lanes. This shift in naval strategy had long-term consequences. Rome, recognizing the strategic importance of maritime control, began integrating naval logistics into its broader imperial apparatus. Sicily became a naval hub. Sardinia and Corsica offered forward supply points. Naval bases in Ostia and Ravenna grew, and the Republic increasingly used sea power not merely to fight wars, but to project imperial reach. Thus, while the battlefield legends of the Punic Wars may center on cavalry flanking maneuvers and mountain crossings, the outcome was ultimately sealed by control of the sea. The decisive confrontation at the Aegates Islands in 241 B.C. where a rebuilt Roman fleet intercepted and destroyed a Carthaginian convoy attempting to resupply its forces in Sicily ended the war. Deprived of logistics, Carthage had no choice but to sue for peace. The treaty terms were severe: massive indemnities, loss of Sicily, and disarmament of the fleet. Rome's mastery of the sea had turned the tide. It was no longer merely a republic of soldiers, it was an empire in the making. In the wake of defeat, Carthage turned its maritime prowess toward commerce. Blocked from expansion, it doubled down on trade. Merchant fleets carried Punic goods to North Africa, the Levant, and Iberia. The city rebuilt not with swords, but with silver. But the specter of Rome remained. And when Hannibal rose, decades later, the struggle resumed not just on land, but across the very waters that had first defined it. The Punic Wars were, in the end, not just wars of soldiers or senators. They were struggles of systems and land and sea, in mines and markets. And at their heart stood two civilizations, mirrors and opposites, destined to test the limits of endurance, innovation, and power. Carthage taught Rome the sea. Rome taught Carthage the cost of failure. Together, they shaped the Mediterranean into a crucible of empire's shores etched with history, its waters still whispering stories of ships, storms, and men who dared to master them. Rome, in contrast, to Carthage's shift toward commercial maritime strategy, consolidated its newly acquired naval capabilities with deliberate and far-reaching infrastructure development. Strategic fleet bases were established at Ostia Putelli and Messenice, positioned to dominate a different maritime corridor. These sites did more than house ships. They became logistical hubs, repair stations, supply depots, and command centers for sustained naval projection. In Ostia, Rome's principal port, permanent shipyards were constructed to enable rapid fleet replenishment. At Putelli, in the Bay of Naples, grain imports from Sicily and Egypt could be safely received and distributed inland. Messana, situated at the mouth of the Strait of Messina, became a vital checkpoint controlling access between eastern and western Mediterranean trade and military routes. Through this integration of fleet deployment and coastal infrastructure, Rome achieved something Carthage had long taken for granted: command of the sea. These maritime developments shaped the operational parameters of the Second Punic War from its inception. Hannibal, acutely aware of Rome's now mature naval supremacy, made a calculated decision to avoid maritime confrontation entirely. His legendary crossing of the Alps was not merely a feat of courage or tactical brilliance, it was a strategic necessity. The Mediterranean had become a Roman lake. Any attempt to transport large armies across it would have resulted in disaster. Land was his only viable axis of advance. This naval asymmetry would shadow the entire 16-year campaign in Italy. Hannibal's strategic mobility was extraordinary, but he remained isolated from his homeland. Carthage could not reliably reinforce or resupply him. Communications were inconsistent, often months delayed or completely severed. His victories at Trebia, Trasimene, and Cannae were tactically devastating, but without seaborne support, they could not be transformed into a decisive strategic advantage. Rome, by contrast, leveraged its control of the seas to operate simultaneously across three active theaters: Spain, Sicily, and Italy. Maritime logistics enabled the rapid redeployment of troops and materiel between these zones, allowing Rome to sustain pressure across a wide geographic arc. Reinforcements could arrive by ship from distant provinces in weeks, not months. Grain and arms flowed uninterrupted. This logistical elasticity allowed the Republic to absorb repeated battlefield losses while maintaining strategic momentum. The significance of naval supremacy was also evident in key episodes, such as the contest for Syracuse. During the First Punic War, King Hiero II had allied with Rome, providing critical intelligence, harbor access, and grain. After his death, his grandson Hieronymus reversed allegiance, aligning with Hannibal. For Carthage, this shift promised access to a major port in eastern Sicily, one that could have served as a forward base for naval operations in the central Mediterranean. However, the Roman siege of Syracuse, led by Marcus Claudius Marcellus, ultimately prevented that scenario. Despite formidable defenses designed by Archimedes' catapults, mirrors, and ingenious mechanical devices, the city fell. Its loss ensured Roman control over Sicilian sea routes and denied Hannibal a potential supply line or staging area in the east. A similar dynamic played out in Tarentum, modern Tarentum. The city's harbor was the most naturally defensible in southern Italy, and its temporary realignment with Carthage threatened Roman coastal control. Yet when Hannibal's supporters within the city opened the gates, the Roman garrison commander withdrew to the citadel overlooking the port. From that elevated position, the Romans retained control of the harbor mouth, preventing Carthaginian naval access and maintaining communication with the Roman fleet offshore. Though the city had nominally fallen, the sea remained Roman. This pattern continued until the final phase of the war. The maritime climax came with Scipio Africanus' daring African expedition in 204 BC, transporting over 35,000 troops and supplies across contested waters into North Africa would have been impossible without absolute naval control. The operation required not just ships, but an integrated logistics network, escorts, provisioning, medical support, and communication relay. Throughout the African campaign, Roman naval dominance ensured uninterrupted supply. Troops received fresh reinforcements, cavalry, siege equipment, and rations. Carthage, unable to interdict these shipments, was forced into defensive action. Even Hannibal's eventual recall from Italy could not reverse the momentum. The importance of maritime strategy reasserted itself during the Third Punic War. Though treaty terms had neutered Carthage's fleet, the city, under existential threat, covertly built a new navy. In a remarkable feat of desperation and ingenuity, the defenders excavated a secret harbor outlet, allowing their fleet to bypass the Roman blockade temporarily. For a brief moment, Carthaginian warships once again challenged Roman waters. But it was too late. The Romans had grown into a fully maritime empire. Their siegecraft, naval logistics, and resource superiority overwhelmed the defenders. The new Punic fleet was destroyed, the city isolated, and resistance broken. Naval power had again decided the war, not with a single climactic battle, but through the sustained dominance of supply, mobility, and blockade. Beyond these tactical moments, the maritime dimensions of the Punic Wars left a broader legacy. Rome's transformation from landlocked republic to sea-spanning empire depended on these conflicts. The permanent integration of naval power into its military doctrine laid the foundation for centuries of imperial expansion. Rome did not merely build ships, it built systems, dockyards, ports, maritime laws, logistical chains, and naval command structures that endured through the imperial period. Technological innovation flourished in this environment. Wartime shipbuilding demands spurred advances in hull design, sail rigging, and boarding equipment. Harbor engineering adapted to accommodate larger vessels and constant traffic. Navigational practices improved as sailors began to chart currents, stars, and wind patterns with new precision. These technologies did not vanish with the war's end. They fueled an explosion of Mediterranean commerce during the Pax Romana. Grain from Egypt, wine from Gaul, marble from Greece, and spices from the Levant flowed through Roman ports. What had begun as wartime infrastructure became the arteries of a globalizing economy in this way. The Punic naval struggles birthed not only an empire, but a maritime world order. Rome's ships carried more than soldiers. They carried systems, law, identity, and culture. Carthage had once ruled the seas. Rome learned, adapted, and inherited that mantle not through inheritance, but through relentless innovation and strategic synthesis. It was on the water, just as much as on land, that the fate of the ancient Mediterranean was decided. And from the foam of those contested waves rose a new world, one shaped not merely by battles, but by a civilization's capacity to sustain its victories through vision, infrastructure, and command of the seas. Perhaps most significantly, the maritime dimension of the Punic conflicts reveals not only strategic preferences, but core institutional distinctions between the rival civilizations. Carthage's early dominance at sea stemmed from generations of maritime experience deeply embedded in a narrow segment of society, primarily aristocratic families whose expertise passed through commercial lineage rather than state instruction. Naval command, shipbuilding knowledge, and navigational skill were often family-held assets, cultivated within guild-like structures that privileged continuity but left the system vulnerable to attrition or disruption. Rome, conversely, responded to its initial naval inferiority not by replicating these oligarchic patterns, but by innovating an entirely new institutional framework. It standardized warship construction using modular design, formalized training regimens for oarsmen and marines, and embedded naval operations within the fabric of state organization. Rather than relying on individual expertise, Rome built systems dockyards, training camps, logistics networks that could outlast any single generation. It transformed naval warfare from a specialized craft into a scalable component of military statecraft. This approach reflected broader differences in governance. Carthage, despite its sophistication, remained dominated by an elite mercantile class whose foreign policy was often shaped by economic interests and negotiated consensus. Rome, by contrast, developed an institutional resilience that allowed it to absorb staggering losses in land and sea and continue fighting. The Republic sustained multi-front wars, managed transitions between elected generals, and maintained strategic coherence even in moments of crisis. Its true genius was not merely tactical, it was organizational in this context. The naval theater becomes a mirror through which we understand how the Roman system, built on citizen soldiers, collective administration, and procedural innovation, ultimately triumphed over Carthage's initial brilliance and specialized knowledge. Where Hannibal represented the apex of individual command excellence, Rome represented the ascendancy of the system. Among the most iconic elements of the Carthaginian military structure, both tactically and symbolically, were the war elephants. Towering, alien, and awe-inspiring, these animals have captured imaginations for centuries. Their role in Punic warfare opens a window into ancient logistics, battlefield psychology, and the balance between spectacle and effectiveness. The elephants, deployed by Carthage, were primarily the now extinct North African forest. Elephants smaller than the Indian species used by Seleucid or Mauryan armies, but still formidable. Carthage's interest in their military application began in earnest after observing Pyrrhus of Epirus during his Sicilian campaigns. Pyrrhus's elephants had stunned Roman legions unused to fighting such beasts, and Punic commanders, recognizing the strategic potential, sought to develop their own capacity. By the later stages of the First Punic War, Carthage had begun organizing specialized elephant corps. These units required a staggering logistical commitment. Each animal consumed an estimated 200 to 300 pounds of fodder daily, necessitating the establishment of supply chains dedicated solely to their maintenance. Facilities near Carthage were constructed for training and breeding, staffed with professional handlers known as mahouts, many of whom developed lifelong relationships with individual animals. Some sources suggest the existence of early veterinary protocols and rudimentary training manuals, evidence of a highly evolved understanding of animal management. But elephants were not merely practical. They were symbols, mobile monuments of Punic power and exoticism. Their presence on the battlefield projected psychological force as much as physical. When deployed effectively, elephants could rupture infantry lines, scatter cavalry, and demoralize opposing troops unused to their sight, smell, or sound. In battle, they performed multiple functions. Some charged into enemy formations to create panic and disarray. Others carried archers or javelin throwers, using height advantage to fire into dense enemy ranks. They also served as mobile command platforms, allowing officers greater visibility and communication across chaotic fields. In psychological terms, they were siege engines of fear. The legendary Alpine crossing, perhaps the most dramatic episode of their deployment, underscored both their symbolic weight and practical limitations. Hannibal is said to have departed New Carthage with 37 elephants, an extraordinary logistical burden given the terrain ahead. The Pyrenees posed challenges, but it was the Alps snowbound, steep, and food scarce that proved nearly fatal. Ancient accounts, including those of Polybius and Livy, described the use of wooden platforms to stabilize the elephants on treacherous slopes, and the construction of trails widened by engineering teams to permit passage. Despite these efforts, the attrition rate was catastrophic. Fewer than 10 elephants survived the crossing, and only a handful remained viable for battle. Yet even these few contributed to early engagements in Italy, particularly at Trebia, where they disrupted Roman cavalry unaccustomed to such beasts. The psychological effect was immediate. Roman horses, smelling and hearing the elephants before seeing them, often panicked and refused to engage. Units broke formation. Communications collapsed. Hannibal's forces exploited these moments with precision, using light infantry to harass disoriented Roman lines. Over time, however, this advantage diminished. Romans adapted. They began developing specific anti-elephant tactics, dedicated formations that opened corridors through which charging elephants could pass harmlessly. Infantry units were trained to remain steady, strike at the elephants' vulnerable legs, or blind them with concentrated missile fire. Specialized anti-elephant squads were issued spears for the eyes, axes for the tendons, and incendiary devices targeting the animals. Acute sensitivity to flame and noise, Roman engineers also deployed portable obstacle stakes, trenches, and traps that funneled elephants into zones where they could be isolated or destroyed. Trumpets and drums disrupted their behavior, confusing handlers and often causing the elephants to trample their own troops. Elephant warfare thus entered a cycle of measure and countermeasure, innovation and adaptation. What had once been an unassailable asset became, by the end of the Second Punic War, a high-maintenance liability. Their battlefield utility never vanished entirely, but it became conditional, context-dependent, and increasingly symbolic. Nevertheless, the elephants' impact extended far beyond immediate tactics. Their presence influenced recruitment in Roman territories. Fear of elephant charges shaped the expectations of citizen soldiers, leading to new training, curricula, and psychological conditioning. Allied cities hesitated to break with Rome, in part due to these terrifying accounts, giving the animals a diplomatic role disproportionate to their numbers. Moreover, the symbolic use of elephants did not end with their military decline. In Roman triumphs, captured elephants were paraded through the streets of the capital not only as trophies, but as proof that Rome had overcome the exotic, the monstrous, and the unfamiliar. They became icons of Rome's victory over chaos and foreignness. In the end, Carthaginian elephants, like Carthaginian ships, tell us as much about systems as about strategy. They represent Carthage's ability to harness the exotic and the impressive, to integrate spectacle and function. But they also underscore the limits of individualized high-cost assets when facing a system capable of adaptation and mass mobilization. Rome, in absorbing and overcoming the challenge of elephant warfare, demonstrated not just tactical ingenuity, but systemic resilience. It learned from fear, codified experience, and responded not with imitation, but with transformation. And in that learning process, Rome did more than defeat Carthage. It became what Carthage once was, an empire of the sea, of logistics, of innovation, and of spectacle harnessed to structure. The elephants may have vanished, but their footprints remain etched into the tactics, memories, and monuments of the empire that conquered them. Perhaps most significantly, the symbolic dimension of elephant warfare extended far beyond immediate military considerations, shaping cultural narratives and collective memory in ways that outlasted their battlefield relevance. To Carthaginian commanders and allies, these majestic creatures served as tangible manifestations of imperial reach, a visible link to the grandeur of Near Eastern and North African traditions of warfare. They connected Carthage not only to innovation, but to deeper archetypes of authority drawn from Achaemenid, Egyptian, and Numidian models of power where kings were often associated with the ability to command nature itself. For Roman observers, however, the elephant quickly became a metaphor for the fundamental otherness of the Carthaginian enemy. These animals, alien to the Italian landscape, seem to embody the foreign threat posed by the Punic state. In Roman ideological frameworks, ready inclined toward moral dichotomy, elephants came to symbolize a deeper cultural and spiritual difference. The Punic Wars were not just wars for land, but wars against exoticism, excess, an empire without republican virtue. This symbolic polarity is visible in contemporary Roman art and numismacy. Victory coins minted during and after the Punic Wars often featured elephants not as Roman trophies, but as synecdoches for Carthage itself. To conquer the elephant was to conquer the unknown, the extravagant, the threatening. Roman triumphs paraded captured elephants through city streets as living monuments of conquest, reinforcing the message of civilizational victory over barbarism and chaos. The lasting cultural impression of elephants was such that some Roman family names may even derive from encounters with them. The most notable example is the gens Julia, and particularly the cognomen Caesar, which several ancient sources speculated might have originated from the slaying or capture of an elephant, Caesai, in a supposed Moorish dialect, though linguistically uncertain. The association reveals the depth of the elephant's integration into Roman historical imagination by the Third Punic War. However, elephants had little practical role. Treaty restrictions following the Second Punic War had curtailed Carthage's ability to maintain military assets, and scarce resources during the final siege left no room for maintaining such high-maintenance units. Yet the symbolic value of elephants persisted. Roman propagandists continued to invoke them as justification for aggression, portraying Carthage as a latent threat capable of resurgence if not utterly destroyed. This dissonance between the absence of elephants in the field and their continued presence in discourse illustrates how deeply the association had been etched into Mediterranean consciousness. Modern archaeology has clarified misconceptions about the species employed by Carthage. Contrary to early assumptions that they used Indian or modern African bush elephants, recent osteological and ecological evidence confirms that Carthaginian armies primarily relied on the now extinct North African forest elephant, Loxodonta africana faroensis. Smaller in stature, generally standing 8 to 9 feet at the shoulder, these animals were nonetheless formidable in ancient battle contexts. Agile, manageable, and less prone to uncontrollable charges, they suited the tactical conditions of Mediterranean warfare. Tragically, this subspecies did not survive into the Common Era. While habitat loss and overhunting contributed to its extinction, Roman conquest accelerated the process. After the fall of Carthage, elite Roman tastes for exotic entertainment surged. Amphitheaters demanded a steady supply of wild beasts for the nation's public spectacles in which animals fought each other or condemned prisoners. Elephants, symbols of power turned into objects of amusement, were hunted across North Africa to meet market demands. By the 2nd century AD, the North African elephant had vanished, a silent ecological casualty of conquest and spectacle. For military historians, the Carthaginian use of elephants presents a fascinating case study in the cost-benefit dynamics of specialized weapon systems. Enormous resources were required for acquisition, training, feeding, and deployment. These animals needed specialized handlers, complicated transportation arrangements, and constant care. Their success in battle was conditional, often determined more by the terrain, weather, and opponent preparedness than by their innate capabilities. And yet, their psychological value was profound. The fear they provoked could unmake formations before the fighting began. Like modern strategic bombers or hypersonic missiles, elephants possessed an aura that could exceed their practical yield. As such, they remind us that warfare is never purely about mechanics. It is about perception, morale, and symbolic leverage. The memory of these war elephants endured long after they disappeared from military rosters. They became subjects of poetry, features in frescoes, and icons in historical writings. From Hannibal's Alpine crossing to Renaissance tapestries, they persisted in the Western imagination as emblems of ancient grandeur, courage, and audacity. Their image survives not because of what they destroyed, but because of what they represented: the ambition of a civilization that dared to master the monstrous. And so, with every great adversary, there emerges the need for an equally great response. Rome, confronted with one of the most brilliant military tacticians in history, found its answer in an unlikely figure, Publius Cornelius Scipio. The life of Scipio Africanus would come to mirror that of his rival in striking ways. Like Hannibal, he was born into a military dynasty, the gens Cornelius Scipianus, and inherited both privilege and expectation. Yet his path to prominence was carved not by inheritance, but by extraordinary deeds. At the age of 17, during the earliest battles of the Second Punic War, he reportedly saved his father, Publius Scipio the Elder. During the chaotic clash at the Ticinus River, this act of bravery, recounted with reverence by Livy and Polybius, prefigured his future as Rome's salvation. His trajectory accelerated dramatically 4 years later, when both his father and uncle were killed in the Iberian theater. Rome, facing a vacuum in leadership, made an extraordinary choice. Scipio, just 25, was entrusted with full proconsular authority to command Roman operations in Spain, despite lacking prior consular office or battlefield command. This decision represented a radical departure from Roman political norms. The cursus honorum, Rome's rigid hierarchy of political advancement, typically prevented such promotions. Yet the Republic, ravaged by war and in desperate need of vision, turned to talent over tradition. Scipio's appointment was not merely a gamble, it was a statement. Rome's survival would depend not just on numbers, but on minds. And in Scipio, they found a strategist with vision to rival Hannibal, and a temperament suited to institutional leadership. As the stage widened from elephants and infantry to empires and ideas, the Mediterranean basin became the arena of their final convergence to commanders. Two civilizations, and one defining confrontation that would seal the fate of the ancient world. The next chapter would belong not to beasts, but to men. To the generals whose fates intertwined in both myth and memory, whose duel would echo from Zama to every frontier Rome would ever know. Scipio's initial campaign in Spain marked a decisive evolution in Roman military thinking, one defined not merely by battlefield maneuvers, but by psychological insight, cultural awareness, and diplomatic finesse. Unlike many of his predecessors, who had relied on brute strength and immediate confrontation, Scipio arrived in Iberia understanding that durable victory required more than arms, it required hearts and minds. He eschewed rapid assaults in favor of careful groundwork, cultivating trust among local tribes and demonstrating an uncharacteristic fluency in indigenous customs and sensibilities. This was not a Roman general imposing imperial will, it was a strategist adapting to his environment. Scipio studied local traditions, attended tribal councils, respected tribal leaders, and formed relationships that bound Iberian communities to the Roman cause, not through coercion but shared interest. His methods, remarkably similar to those Hannibal had employed years earlier during his own Iberian campaigns, yielded powerful dividends. Rome, once seen as a foreign occupier, began to be viewed as a viable ally. Nowhere was Scipio's strategic ingenuity more visible than in the capture of New Carthage. Carthago, Nova, the linchpin of Punic power in the region. Rather than laying siege in the traditional sense, he sought out weaknesses others overlooked, noticing that the lagoon side of the city had lower walls, due to the natural protection afforded by the waters. He discovered that prevailing offshore winds could, at intervals, lower the water level enough to make a crossing feasible. Timing his assault with precision, he launched a frontal attack as a diversion while dispatching a small, agile unit through the shallows. The result was extraordinary. A fortified stronghold, believed impregnable, fell in a single day, Scipio. Handling of the aftermath was as calculated as the assault itself. Carthaginian held hostages, many of them the sons of local Iberian chieftains, were immediately released without ransom. This act transformed potential hostility into gratitude, aligning previously wavering tribes firmly with the Roman cause. Female captives, including one renowned for her beauty and reportedly offered to the general as a spoil of war, were returned unharmed to their families or fiancés. These choices built a personal mythology around Scipio of honor, restraint, and moral superiority that extended Rome's influence as effectively as any legion. His campaign culminated at the Battle of Ilipa in 206 BC, where Scipio demonstrated mastery not only of Roman arms, but of deception, the very tool that had brought Rome low at places like Cannae. For several days, he deployed his troops in a predictable pattern: Roman legions at the center, Spanish auxiliaries on the wings. On the decisive morning, he reversed this arrangement and launched a surprise early attack before Carthaginian troops had completed their preparations. The result was a rout. Carthaginian control of Iberia disintegrated. By adapting Hannibal's methods and perfecting them, Scipio had avenged his family, expelled Rome's greatest threat from the region, and elevated himself into the pantheon of Rome's military elite. His triumphant return to Rome, however, exposed the tension between individual excellence and republican restraint. His proposal to carry the war directly into North Africa, bold strategic gambit, met with resistance. Conservative figures like Quintus Fabius Maximus, architect of the delay strategy, warned against rash overreach. The Senate, fearing the risks and perhaps the man himself, granted approval only without official support, compelling Scipio to raise and train a volunteer army bound not by state mandate, but by personal loyalty. In Africa, Scipio applied the lessons of Hannibal's own campaigns against Rome. He established a stronghold near Utica, building up forces deliberately and forming a critical alliance with Massinissa, the Numidian prince ousted by rival Scipio. Massinissa's cavalry, mobile and battle-hardened, became the decisive edge in the campaign, an asset Hannibal himself once wielded, but now saw turned against him. At the climactic Battle of Zama in 202 BC, Scipio orchestrated a perfect demonstration of Roman adaptation and tactical creativity. Anticipating an elephant charge, he spaced his manipular formations to create open corridors. As the beasts thundered forward, they passed through the gaps, their momentum neutralized. The Carthaginian center, now unsupported, was engaged by Roman infantry, while Scipio's cavalry, bolstered by Massinissa's Numidians, encircled the flanks. It was a deliberate reversal of Cannae, where once Rome had been enveloped, now Rome enveloped the peace terms that followed. Zama displayed Scipio's political foresight. He stripped Carthage of offensive capabilities, surrender of fleet, war indemnities, and a ban on waging war without Rome's permission, yet stopped short of total destruction. He rejected calls from hawks like Cato the Elder for annihilation, instead envisioning Carthage as a buffer against Numidian expansion and a check on instability in the region. His diplomacy aimed not only at immediate victory, but at sustainable regional order. His post-war career exemplified the dual legacy of military greatness in a republic wary of personal power. Granted the unprecedented title, Africanus, by popular acclaim, his triumphs were celebrated with unmatched grandeur. But beneath the applause stirred the undercurrents of senatorial anxiety. The Republic, still scarred by memories of monarchic rule, grew uneasy with men whose popularity rivaled institutional authority. Accusations of financial misconduct, levied against both Scipio and his brother Lucius after campaigns in the East, reflected this anxiety more than actual guilt. Scipio, disillusioned, withdrew from public life, his exit from politics voluntary, yet symbolic of Rome's uneasy relationship with greatness. In both character and career, Scipio mirrored and contrasted Hannibal. Like his adversary, he was multilingual, intellectually refined, and physically disciplined. Like Hannibal, he exhibited empathy toward allies, foresight in strategy, and flexibility in tactics. Both men represented the apex of leadership born of crisis. Yet their legacies diverged because of the systems they served. Hannibal operated largely outside of formal state structures, drawing power from his family's prestige and his personal oath. His campaign was a personal mission rooted in familial loyalty and vengeance. When defeated, the state offered no sanctuary. He died in exile, pursued to the end by a republic that feared his intellect more than his armies. Scipio, by contrast, remained rooted in the Roman system, even as it bent to accommodate his genius. Though ultimately marginalized politically, he was never cast out. His name and his descendants would live on in senatorial roles and military traditions. His victories became Rome's legacy, not his alone. That system absorbed greatness, institutionalized it, and replicated it. Scipio's innovations, his integration of foreign cavalry, his emphasis on tactical surprise, his cultivation of alliances became standard features of Roman warfare. His legacy lived in doctrines, not just in memory. The impact of Scipio Africanus reaches far beyond Zama. It is found in the auxilia of the Roman legions, in the diplomatic strategies of future consuls, in the very structure of imperial command. He embodied a turning point, from republic to expansionist power, from reactive defense to proactive empire. His life, like Hannibal's, was forged in war, but where one became a ghost of resistance, the other became the architect of an age. Scipio Africanus' ability to synthesize Rome's traditional military virtues with tactical innovations borrowed from her adversaries signaled a pivotal evolution in the Roman way of war. Rather than discarding institutional principles in pursuit of glory, he demonstrated how adaptive thinking could coexist with the structured discipline of a republican system. His strategies blended the organizational strength, resilience, and moral seriousness of Roman tradition with the psychological acuity and battlefield creativity exemplified by Hannibal. This fusion produced a new template for Roman generalship, one that future commanders would emulate from Caesar to Trajan. More critically, Scipio's career proved that Rome's republican institutions, often dismissed by contemporaries and later historians as rigid and risk-averse, could, in fact, identify, elevate, and empower exceptional individuals without collapsing into autocracy. Unlike Hannibal, whose rise was tied to familial networks and personal oaths rather than formal office, Scipio's ascent unfolded within and ultimately affirmed the constitutional frameworks of the Republic. His achievements became a case study in the Roman capacity to produce greatness without surrendering. Institutional balance. This ability to cultivate excellence within constraint became a cornerstone of Rome's future success. In centuries to come, as Rome absorbed vast provinces, governed hundreds of cultures, and fielded armies across 3 continents, the principles exemplified by Scipio would remain relevant. Leadership emerged not solely from birth or charisma, but from a meritocratic system that, at its best, could match and even surpass the brilliance of monarchies and empires. that relied on singular genius. Thus, the intertwined narratives of Scipio and Hannibal transcend the realm of personal biography. They serve as reflections of the civilizations that produced them, civilizations with different assumptions about authority, loyalty, and governance. Their careers, running parallel and converging at Zama, illuminate the role of the individual in shaping history, but also show how political systems determine the legacy of that individual. Hannibal's battlefield genius failed to alter the course of his nation's fate. Scipio's victory, embedded within a larger institutional structure, reshaped the world. Scipio Africanus was not merely a general, he was the personification of Rome's synthesis of personal valor and collective discipline. His career illustrated the balance between individual brilliance and republican restraint, a balance that allowed Rome to survive crisis, absorb defeat, and emerge stronger. That balance would prove more enduring than any battlefield triumph. It was not the genius of a single man, but the resilience of a system that would carry Rome forward. And yet, 50 years after the thunder of hooves and elephants at Zama had faded, the specter of Carthage continued to haunt Roman political imagination. One Roman senator in particular, Marcus Porcius Carta, known to history as Cato, the elder would conclude every speech in the Senate, regardless of topic, with the same refrain: Ceterum censeo Carthaginem esse delendum. Furthermore, I consider that Carthage must be destroyed. This refrain did not emerge from paranoia alone. As a veteran statesman, Cato had traveled to Carthage on a diplomatic mission and returned deeply disturbed. Despite the severe limitations imposed after the Second Punic War, loss of territory, crippling indemnities, a disarmed military Carthage had not only survived, but thrived. The city's commercial vitality had returned with astonishing speed. Its ports bustled with trade, its merchant fleets multiplied, and its agricultural wealth, once again, made it the granary of North Africa. Roman unease intensified as they observed the quiet re-emergence of Punic prosperity. Carthaginian political reforms, implemented during the brief post-war tenure of Hannibal as Suffet chief magistrate, had rooted out fiscal corruption and created a more efficient, streamlined state. Debt repayments to Rome were not only met, but completed ahead of schedule. Agricultural treatises, attributed to Mago, a Carthaginian nobleman, documented advanced techniques in irrigation, crop rotation, and estate management that impressed even Roman agronomists. To Rome's conservative elites, this stability was not commendable, it was ominous. Their worldview demanded dominance, and any rival's resurgence, however peaceful, posed a threat. At the same time, Rome itself was straining under the burden of its expanding empire. Its republican machinery, designed to govern a city-state, was now stretched across the Mediterranean. Provincial mismanagement, widespread corruption among governors, and growing unrest in distant territories created anxieties that Carthage's efficiency seemed to mock. The immediate trigger for war came from border disputes between Carthage and its aggressive neighbor, Numidia, ruled by King Massinissa, the same Massinissa who had once ridden with Scipio at Zama. Massinissa, emboldened by Roman friendship, began annexing Carthaginian borderlands, citing vague historical claims. The treaty signed after Zama forbade Carthage from engaging in war without Rome's consent, leaving the city powerless to defend itself. Each Carthaginian appealed to Rome for arbitration resulted in commissions that sided with Massinissa. The Roman Senate offered sympathy, but no intervention. This slow dismemberment by proxy infuriated the Carthaginian populace and pushed the state toward desperation. After Massinissa seized fertile lands in the Bagradas Valley, vital agricultural zone, Carthage mustered an army to defend its borders. In doing so, it technically violated the treaty with Rome. The Roman response was swift and severe. Carthage's military failure in the skirmish with Numidia provided the pretext the Senate had long awaited. A consular delegation was sent to Carthage with an ultimatum: surrender 300 sons of the leading aristocratic families as hostages and relinquish all weapons of war. Hoping to avoid annihilation, Carthage complied, sending its children and its arsenal to Rome as tokens of submission. Then came the final demand, one so audacious that it exposed Rome's true intentions. The entire population of Carthage was to abandon their city and relocate at least 10 miles inland. Carthage, the jewel of the Phoenician West, was to be emptied, severed from the sea that had sustained its identity for 7 centuries. This was no negotiation. It was the decree of cultural erasure. Faced with existential annihilation, the Carthaginian people chose resistance over submission. The disarmed city erupted into collective mobilization. Workshops were converted into foundries. Farmers became smiths. Women donated their hair for catapult ropes. Temples were stripped of gold and bronze to craft swords and shields. Hidden caches of tools were refashioned into weapons. Carthage, long barred from warfare, rediscovered its martial spirit in the face of extinction. Within months, a civilian population once denied arms had constructed formidable defenses. They reinforced the triple walls, rebuilt harbor fortifications, and created new weapons in repurposed mines and artisan quarters. This transformation astonished Roman observers. What had been expected to be a symbolic act of domination turned into a prolonged siege against a city that refused to die, and Carthage would not fall easily. The walls, some 40 feet high and fortified with towers and internal kill zones, repelled multiple Roman assaults. The city's complex street layout, narrow alleys, and hidden stockpiles turned urban combat into a nightmare. The harbor, though blocked, was secretly expanded to allow a new fleet to escape briefly and challenge the blockade. Rome, expecting a swift resolution, found itself entangled in a 3-year campaign. What had begun as a ritual execution of an ancient rival became a grinding, humiliating war that tested Roman endurance and exposed how little Carthage had truly declined. This was no longer a geopolitical dispute. It was an apocalyptic struggle between memory and forgetting. Rome, obsessed with securing its legacy, believed Carthage must vanish. Carthage, in its final hours, became an idea as much as a city, the idea that a people could define themselves in resistance, not merely in victory. And so, as the siege dragged on, with Carthaginian youth fighting house to house and Roman legions battering the gates of history itself, the Mediterranean watched as 2 worlds collided for the final time. The result would not merely reshape Africa, would remake the memory of empire, identity, and endurance for centuries to come. The artificial harbor complex at Carthage, a marvel of ancient engineering, was not merely a logistical asset, was a statement of Punic ingenuity, featuring sophisticated dry docks, warehouse facilities, and multi-tiered docking bays for both merchant and warships. It had long served as the arterial heart of the city's naval power, even in its final days. Its complex fortifications and cunning countermeasures complicated Roman efforts to enforce a naval blockade. Roman engineers, initially unfamiliar with such maritime sophistication, were forced to adapt on the fly. Yet, it was not engineering alone that challenged them. It was the intensity of the defenders, the raw, unyielding human will that animated every barricade and every ambush. The citizens of Carthage, though disarmed by treaty and surrounded by empire, refused to capitulate. The Romans, who had grown accustomed to swift surrender in the face of overwhelming force, found themselves facing a city willing to transform every alley, every rooftop, every storeroom into a redoubt of resistance. Initial Roman operations suffered from a perilous combination of overconfidence and logistical shortfalls. Consul Manius Manilius launched a premature assault without proper siege equipment, only to meet with humiliating losses. Carthaginian counterattacks, supported by flaming ships and newly constructed fire rafts, inflicted further damage on Censor and his fleet. These early failures emboldened the defenders and created a psychological shift. What had begun as a punitive expedition now became a grinding campaign with no easy path to victory. The tide turned with the appointment of Publius Cornelius Scipio, Aemilianus' grandson by adoption of Scipio Africanus. Unlike his predecessors, Aemilianus recognized the nature of the task before him, not simply to storm a city, but to bury a civilization. He abandoned frontal assaults in favor of a long, methodical strangulation. His forces constructed massive circumvallation walls encircling the city entirely by land. Trenches were dug, towers raised, and supply routes cut. Naval patrols intensified, converting the sea from Carthage's ancient ally into an unbroken horizon of enemy sails. Yet Carthage responded with a final burst of genius. In secret, engineers labored within the city to carve a new harbor outlet through solid stone. Working under constant threat of collapse and detection, they forged an escape route for ships hastily constructed in hidden docks. When these vessels burst forth into the Mediterranean, they momentarily shattered Roman assumptions of total control. Though the tactical advantage was brief, the ships were outmatched. The symbolic force was immense. Carthage had not simply resisted, it had created. As spring returned, the Romans launched their final assault, concentrating on the harborside quarter where disease and famine had eroded resistance. Here, at the entrance to the Cone harbor, Roman legions breached the weakened defenses. What followed was not a battle, but a slow-motion collapse. The Romans advanced street by street, encountering barricades built of furniture and corpses. Windows turned into archer slits, and boiling oil poured from rooftops. Every block became a war zone, every home a fortress. The last stand occurred in the Biasa district, a religious and political citadel that had anchored Carthaginian life for centuries. Here, the remaining population, thousands of civilians, among them, crowded into temples and upper terraces. According to classical sources, mass suicides erupted among the elite, unwilling to live as Roman slaves. The wife of Hasdrubal, commander of the city's final defense, denounced her husband's surrender in front of Roman officers before casting herself and her children into the flames of the temple. Scipio Aemilianus, watching the city burn, is said to have wept. What Rome did next was not merely conquest, it was erasure. Under senatorial directive, Aemilianus ordered the complete destruction of the city. Every surviving structure was pulled down, stone by stone, column by column. Roofs were collapsed with picks and fire. Statues were defaced. Walls were breached from within and left to rot in the sun. Agricultural land surrounding the city, once a fertile breadbasket, was symbolically salted Though modern historians debate whether literal salt was used, the intent was clear. No Carthage would rise again. The surviving population, those not killed in the siege, were sold into slavery and scattered across the Roman world. Children were separated from parents, nobles from citizens, all sent to different provinces. This systematic dispersal was not mere vengeance, it was strategic. It was designed to ensure that never again would the idea of Carthage coalesce into something real, in what might be the most chilling cultural assault of all. Carthage's libraries were burned. All texts, religious and scientific, philosophical and historical, were destroyed, except one. The agricultural writings of Mago, so admired even by Roman agronomists, were preserved, translated into Latin, and assimilated into the Roman canon. Everything else gone, the collective memory of a civilization, wiped away by design. Archaeology affirms these accounts. Excavations in modern Tunis reveal a dense destruction layer beneath Roman strata, burned bones, melted bronze, shattered amphorae. The city's grand double harbour, one of the wonders of the ancient world, was filled in, its docks dismantled beyond repair. Only in recent decades have remote sensing and stratigraphic analysis begun to uncover Punic layers long thought lost. In place of the annihilated metropolis, Rome established a new colony. Julius Caesar proposed it. Augustus implemented it. Colonia, Julia, Carthago rose atop the Ash, a city of Latin speech and Roman stone, built deliberately on the bones of its predecessor. Though it would become a thriving provincial capital, home to senators, merchants, and even early Christian bishops, it bore no spiritual or cultural link to the city it replaced. It was Rome's Carthage, not Carthage reborn. The obliteration of Carthage became both a monument to Roman might and a warning whispered across centuries. Polybius, who witnessed the siege and stood beside Aemilianus as the fires consumed the temples, recorded his general's words with solemn dread. A glorious moment, Polybius, but I fear that one day the same fate may befall Rome. Carthage had stood as an alternate model of Mediterranean civilization, Phoenician in origin, African in geography, multicultural in character. Its strengths were not Rome's. It prized trade over territory, diplomacy over militarism, ingenuity over tradition, and for that, perhaps, it was feared more deeply than any barbarian horde. The thoroughness of its destruction ensured that all future Mediterranean development would proceed along Roman lines. Carthage was not merely defeated, was unmade. Yet, ironically, it is in this very completeness that we find the seeds of modern caution. The phrase Carthaginian peace now stands as a dark archetype, a peace so total it leaves no trace of the vanquished, only the victor's silence. The irony is brutal. Rome's fear of Carthage's return became the justification for a strategy that created the very resistance it claimed to prevent. By stripping Carthage of autonomy, by humiliating it through forced submission and endless concessions, Rome fostered desperation and then punished that desperation with extinction. And yet, Carthage never vanished entirely. Modern archaeological methods have begun to uncover buried Punic neighborhoods beneath Roman layers, fragments of walls, ceramic inscriptions, religious tokens hidden in cisterns. These whisper of a culture that, though decapitated, left embers smoldering beneath the imperial overlay. Its language echoes faintly in surviving toponyms. Its technical knowledge migrated to Roman authors. Its spirit of resilience above all remains. Embedded in the story, Carthage, erased from maps, remains etched into memory. In its burning, Rome illuminated the costs of empire, merely for the defeated, but for those who believe history can be controlled by fire alone. A reminder persists across the millennia. Even the most thorough and deliberate acts of cultural annihilation rarely achieve complete success. Beneath the ash of Carthage, fragments of resilience endure not only in archaeology, but in the corridors of modern thought. In the hushed lecture halls of the United States Naval War College, the battles of Cannae and Zama are dissected with the same scrutiny given to Waterloo, Midway, or Fallujah. At West Point, Sandhurst, and a colder Gare, cadets trace flanking maneuvers and coalition dynamics first executed on Mediterranean plains 2,000 years ago. Their lessons, timeless. In the glass towers of global finance, boardroom strategists sketch out growth models and competitive responses grounded in principles first refined by spear and sword. Corporate executives speak of encirclement, attrition, shock, and are not as metaphors, but as operational models. Hannibal Barca, once feared as a barbarian threat to civilization, now appears as a muse to CEOs and military generals alike. His campaigns reimagined as case studies in audacity, adaptability, and complex systems management. The continued relevance of the Punic Wars lies not in their antiquity, but in their foundational place within Western conceptions of power, order, and resistance. These conflicts between Rome and Carthage offered early and enduring models of asymmetric warfare, coalition maintenance, strategic endurance, and the constant tension between innovation and tradition. Though fought with bronze and iron, the questions they posed remain questions of leadership, decision-making under uncertainty, and how civilizations endure or collapse under pressure. Hannibal's campaign in Italy still features prominently in courses on maneuver warfare. His operational artistry, the double envelopment at Cannae, remains the definitive study in coordinated battlefield dynamics, taught not as a relic, but as a blueprint. His use of terrain at Lake Trasimene, exploiting fog, topography, and overconfidence, illustrates the timeless utility of deception, and Rome's institutional response to these humiliations, reorganizing its army, refining recruitment, learning from its defeats rather than collapsing under the mothballs. A masterclass in organizational resilience under existential threat. The Punic Wars remain a crucible of operational art. Hannibal's capacity to project force deep into hostile territory without secure supply lines, relying on speed, diplomacy, and foraging, became a model for later commanders like Frederick the Great, Napoleon Bonaparte, and George Patton. Conversely, Rome's emphasis on structured logistics, secure supply corridors, and layered reserve systems prefigured modern military doctrines that prize reliability and sustainability over risk-heavy maneuver. Contemporary military planners and strategic theorists continue to contrast these two models. Rome's methodical and process-driven approach favored standardized gear, modular units, and institutional redundancy, precursors to modern force design. Carthage, with its coalition armies and hybrid logistics, depended on charismatic leadership and operational creativity more akin to special operations forces or insurgent coalitions in contemporary terms. The tension between adaptability and stability, between flash brilliance and systemic depth, remains at the heart of modern defense debates. Political scientists and students of international relations study the diplomatic chessboard that surrounded the battlefield. Rome's ability to maintain alliances despite repeated defeats through credible commitment, occasional brutality, and a reputation for resilience demonstrated early models of hegemony building. The manipulation of treaties, the integration of former enemies, and the use of calculated incentives and punishments to manage allies foreshadowed later imperial strategies. From British India to Cold War NATO diplomacy. Carthage's approach, by contrast, revolved around transactional loyalty, elite diplomacy, an opportunistic alliances system that excelled under strong leadership but frayed in its absence. Hannibal's personal rapport with Gallic tribes and Iberian chieftains secured victories, but it lacked the institutional scaffolding to survive his eventual departure. This contrast between individual charisma and institutional integration still echoes in modern foreign policy frameworks, especially in coalition-building efforts and failed state interventions. Leadership theorists across sectors, from military academies to MBA programs, continue to extract dual archetypes from these opposing systems. Hannibal exemplifies the visionary disruptor, multilingual, culturally agile, tactically brilliant, capable of inspiring loyalty across ethnic and linguistic lines. He moved fast, thought ahead, and saw what others could not. His style was improvisational, but strategically aimed at a larger endgame. Rome, in contrast, developed and rewarded distributed leadership. Scipio Africanus, though extraordinary, operated within a system that could train, promote, and sustain excellence at scale. Roman success lay in its depth of talent, in standardized training and institutional memory. The Roman army could absorb losses, retrain replacements, and continue operations less reliant on any one man. These competing models, charismatic disruption versus institutional scaling, form the basis of contemporary organizational leadership paradigms. Technological innovation in the Punic Wars likewise retains surprising relevance. Rome's creation of the Corvessa boarding bridge that neutralized Carthage's naval maneuver advantage stands as a classic asymmetric innovation. Rather than match Punic seamanship, Rome redefined the parameters of battle. Similarly, Hannibal's Alpine crossing, employing engineering creativity to move elephants and infantry through hostile terrain, demonstrates the power of solving environmental challenges through inventive means. These events find echoes in modern responses to technological disruption, where underdog organizations develop niche tools to counter dominant platforms. The concept of turning an enemy's strength into a vulnerability remains core to competitive strategy, whether in cyber warfare, energy markets, or mobile telecommunications. The wider socio-economic systems of the two civilizations have also become parallels for contemporary thinkers. Carthage, with its maritime trade networks, agile merchant class, and innovation-friendly institutions, is often likened to today's dynamic market economies. Rome, with its structured bureaucracy, agrarian core, and emphasis on infrastructure, resembles centralized nation-states, prioritizing standardization and territorial control. The clash between these models, commerce-driven fluidity versus land-based order, finds resonance in today's geopolitical tensions between liberal globalism and state-centered nationalism. Business schools now teach these distinctions as lenses for understanding disruption versus consolidation. Startups and innovation hubs look to Carthage, mobile, adaptive, horizontally integrated. Legacy firms and governmental institutions align with Rome, robust, hierarchical, built to scale. In both models, success hinges not just on what is done but how it is aligned with deeper values, structures, and cultures. The Punic Wars, then, are more than a historical episode. They are a mirror in which we continually examine ourselves. Through them, we confront questions of leadership and legacy, of power and restraint, of how civilizations choose to wield their strength and respond to their fears. We find in them the roots of modern strategy and the enduring human drama behind the clash of ideas, not just armies. Whether on the battlefield, in the boardroom, or within institutions that shape our world, the lessons remain urgent, alive, and waiting to be understood anew. The ultimate Roman victory achieved not through any singular, sustained brilliance of leadership, but through a relentless institutional resilience offers cautionary lessons that echo through time. In contrast to Carthage's reliance on the genius of a single commander, Rome's ability to absorb defeat, adapt methodically, and leverage the strengths of its system proved the more durable asset. This contrast continues to resonate in business strategy, where short-term brilliance often dazzles, but it is long-term structure and systemic adaptability that determine lasting success. Sustainable competitive advantage, forged through consistency, process, and scalability, remains the keystone of organizational longevity. Popular culture continues to process and reinterpret these historical events, translating their themes into new artistic expressions that reflect evolving societal anxieties and values. Cinema, with its affinity for epic conflict and grand spectacle, has frequently attempted to bring Hannibal's legendary Alpine crossing to life. While technical and budgetary limitations have historically constrained full cinematic realization, filmmakers have continued to be drawn to the mythic scale and symbolic power of this actor, military endeavor that remains unmatched in its audacity and logistical improbability. Historical fiction has taken up the task with greater success. From Gustave Flaubert's Salomba to Ross Lecky's Hannibal, novelists have returned time and again to the Punic landscape, using its stark contrasts and moral complexity as a lens for reflecting on contemporary issues: imperialism, cultural collision, the burden of command, and the nature of greatness. These retellings, though varying in historical fidelity, serve a deeper function. They preserve the cultural memory of the Punic conflict as a crucible in which themes of identity, fate, and legacy are forged. Meanwhile, archaeological investigations have continued to enrich our understanding of these ancient events, providing a crucial material counterpoint to literary narratives. Excavations along Hannibal's Alpine route, once dismissed as legend, have uncovered remnants of encampments, trail markings, and even fecal bacteria in soil layers that align with ancient troop movements. These findings lend new credence to classical sources, while simultaneously revealing the immense logistical complexity of Hannibal's operations in Sicilian waters. Underwater archaeology has retrieved bronze rams from sunken warships of the First Punic War, silent witnesses. Two naval engagements fought over millennia ago. These artifacts tell stories not recorded in Livy or Polybius. Stories of shipbuilders, helmsmen, and marines whose roles were vital, if unsung. In North Africa, beneath the modern city of Tunis, archaeologists continue to unearth layers of ancient Carthage. Urban layouts, coinage, inscriptions, and domestic architecture reveal a level of cultural sophistication that defies simplistic portrayals of Carthage as merely a mercantile rival to Rome. Digital humanities have joined this exploration. Computational analysis of ancient texts using network theory now enables scholars to map the full extent of diplomatic ties and alliance. Systems previously obscured by narrative focus on major actors. GIS, Geographic Information Systems, integrated with archaeological datasets, allow for precise reconstruction of campaign routes, supply lines, and battlefield topography, offering new insight into the choices and constraints faced by ancient generals. These technological innovations in research methodology underscore a larger truth. Even events as exhaustively studied as the Punic Wars continue to yield new knowledge when viewed through novel lenses. Our understanding grows not only with new data, but with new questions shaped by modern challenges and values. Educational institutions have recognized the pedagogical richness of the Punic Wars. Their dramatic arc, featuring charismatic leaders, dramatic reversals, moral dilemmas, and world-altering consequences, makes them uniquely suited for developing critical thinking and ethical reasoning. Instructors use these conflicts to challenge students to think beyond dates and names, to explore the tensions between structural determinism and individual agency, between justice and pragmatism, between loyalty and ambition. Ethical inquiries have gained special traction. Scholars increasingly question the morality of Rome's conduct during and after the conflict. Was the annihilation of Carthage a necessary act of preemptive security or an egregious case of cultural erasure? What responsibility do victors have toward defeated populations? The Roman decision to raise an entire civilization, a deliberate policy of cultural extinction, invites troubling parallels to modern acts of genocide, cultural cleansing, and imperial suppression. The mass suffering during the final siege, the calculated demands for surrender, and the symbolic destruction of libraries, temples, and families provoke urgent ethical reflection. These events compel us to examine leadership not only for its strategic merit, but for its moral dimensions. What happens when fear justifies the obliteration of identity? When victory demands the unmaking of memory? And yet, perhaps the most profound reason the Punic Wars continue to resonate is that they illuminate timeless tensions at the core of human organization. The dialectic between individual brilliance and institutional durability, between disruption and preservation, between pluralism and central control. These are not merely historical abstractions. They are the very questions that animate our world today. In the 21st century, humanity grapples with challenges Hannibal and Scipio could never have imagined. Climate destabilization, digital surveillance, pandemics, artificial intelligence, and planetary colonization. Yet the principles that guided Rome and Carthage, how to mobilize collective resources, how to lead under pressure, how to negotiate coexistence with difference, remain strikingly relevant. Modern states still wrestle with questions of how to integrate innovation without undermining social cohesion. Corporations face the task of scaling operations while retaining agility. Military planners debate the balance between manned systems and autonomous platforms, not unlike the contrast between Rome's heavily structured legions and Hannibal's fast-moving, multicultural forces. The legacy of the Punic Wars is not confined to textbooks or marble busts. It lives in leadership seminars, in policy think tanks, in ethics classrooms, and in the decision matrices of organizations across every sector. It reminds us that the past is not a dead weight, but a mirror, that long-vanished decisions echo in our own, that Carthage, though destroyed, still teaches, that Rome, though triumphant, still warns. In the end, the dust of Cannae, the stones of Zama, and the ash of Carthage are not just remnants of antiquity. They are markers on the road of human striving, indicators of what we are capable of, for good or ill. So long as societies must grapple with existential threats, balance competing values, and elevate leadership that serves more than ambition. The Punic Wars will remain more than memory. They will be a living framework for understanding who we are and who we might become.